Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Michael Lawrence, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Asia Trade in the New World Order, the annual Asia House Signature Conference. Today, our focus is on one of the most important and divisive issues of our time, global trade. The trade war between the US and China, the challenge to the existing rules-based order, and the massive disruption of new technology has put trade at the center of geopolitics, of economics and business and society. Asia House is a center of expertise on trade, investment and policy, and we are honored to be convening this dialogue, this very important dialogue in Singapore. Thank you for making us so very welcome. In a moment, we will welcome to the stage His Excellency Chan Chon Sing, Singapore's Minister for Trade and Industry, who will deliver this morning's keynote address. The Minister will then join me on stage for a question and answer session. We have a packed agenda. We'll be looking at the dramatic shifts in global trading architecture in our opening panel at a time of escalating tensions between China and the US. After the break, we'll turn to technology. Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, one of the world's leading thinkers on artificial intelligence, will head a session which will also feature speakers from IBM, Twitter, Ripple, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And finally, we'll be looking at the Belt and Road Initiative, which China says will usher in a new era of globalization, which has been meeting increasing resistance from countries concerned about debt implications, and particularly from the US, which is looking to counter China's growing regional influence. We welcome your participation in today's event. We'll invite your questions and comments in each of the sessions and trust you'll play an active role in the discussion. But first, to extend his welcome, I'd like to invite to the stage the Chairman of Asia House, Lord Stephen Green.
Thank you, Michael. And it's a very great pleasure for me to be back in Singapore. The last time was a year ago, and I try to come here about every year. I'm a great believer, as somebody who grew up in Britain, lived a fair amount of his life in Asia, but now back in Britain, in the idea that anybody who wants to understand the way the world ticks these days has to come east. They used to say, go west, young man. I now think you should say, go east, young person, because all of the most exciting developments in the world's economies and some of the most challenging geopolitical issues too are taking place in the Asia of our times. So talking about a new global order and the issues of trade here in Singapore in the heart of ASEAN is extremely appropriate, and therefore it really is a great pleasure to be back here. I chair Asia House. I used to chair HSBC. One organization is slightly bigger than the other one, but they have in common their focus on this, the most dynamic part of the world. There are a lot of issues, Michael has already alluded to them, in the world economic scene at the moment. We had, as recently as yesterday, the OECD's report on the implications of developing trade tensions for global economic growth, and it doesn't make good reading. But we know what the big themes are: the rising tensions between the US and China, the issues within the Asian continent between China and the Belt Road Initiative and a nervous India. We'll be talking about those kinds of issues a little later on. And the country that I live in is embroiled in the Brexit saga, and indeed today Theresa May is in Brussels trying to reach the final contours of a deal for Britain's withdrawal. This cannot be a good idea, but at least we better ensure that this happens without a no-deal catastrophe. And so wherever you look, politics is interesting, shall we say, and its impact on economics is very important. But you haven't come here to listen to me. You have come here for an extremely interesting morning, and we're very honored, Your Excellency, that Deputy Prime Minister Chan Chon Sing has come to give us our keynote address. Your Excellency, may I welcome you to the stage.
Green of Heritage Point, Chairman of Asia House, Mr. Michael Lawrence, Chief Executive of Asia House, Excellencies, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. I don't propose to give a keynote address. I intend to make a few points, and I perhaps prefer to hear from you than have a discussion with you. First, excuse me, I think we are all living in interesting times. And there are three sets of decisions, three sets of choices that will probably determine our collective future. Let me start with the first, and that is the US-China relations. The key question is how will US and China relate to each other, and that will determine the global geopolitical backdrop for all trade and economics to happen. The current US-China trade frictions is but a symptom that reflects more fundamental contradictions within their economies and societies. That's my hypothesis. We cannot discuss the US-China trade friction, trade deficits, without being cognizant of the challenges within their respective economies. Let me start with the US. The US trade deficit cannot be seen in isolation without understanding the US fiscal policy and monetary posture. For those of us who study economics and understand the GDP equation very well, you will know what I mean. The second internal challenge of the US is how will it reconcile the differential growth rates between the coastal states that are benefiting much from globalization and some of the other states that do not benefit as much. How will the US redistribute the unequal spread of benefits from globalization will be the second internal challenge of the US. Last but not least for the US will have to decide how it can maintain its dynamism and this dynamism has for many years been underpinned by its system of being open to global trade and talent flows. On the side of the Chinese, they too have their fair share of challenges. And there are at least three. First, how will the Chinese rebalance their economy between an investment-led system and a consumption-led growth? Second, how will the Chinese reconcile state-led capitalism with the need for market discipline in all that it does? Third, how will the Chinese unleash the potential of its huge population without losing political control? So the US and Chinese relationships are at a crossroads. To resolve their bilateral relationships and bring it to the next higher plane, to put it on a positive footing, both of them will need to seriously consider how they manage their domestic challenges. Because failure to address their domestic challenges, leading to a local backlash, will bring about global consequences. And both the US and the Chinese, as the largest players on the geopolitical scene, has a choice to make. To paraphrase Vice President Joe Biden, both can decide if they were to demonstrate the power of their example or to demonstrate the example of their power. So this set of questions will determine the future of US-China relationship, and this will set the global backdrop of what we have to overcome collectively as a global system. Let me move on now to the second set of challenges that perhaps the audience here would be very much involved in and interested. And that is the EU and the UK beyond Brexit. I can understand and I can appreciate that a lot of effort and attention, especially in the recent months, have been focused on how do we get to Brexit. But perhaps I will reframe that perspective by asking another question. And perhaps that is a more important question. How does the EU, and for that matter, the UK, want to relate to the world beyond Brexit? What happens after the 30th of March 2019? And perhaps that is a more important question. Because the issue is this: Brexit or not, what role does the EU want to play on the global stage? Is it one of integration, or is it one of isolation? Challenges there will be, and the EU has its fair share of challenges. Immigration, differential fiscal posture, so on and so forth. All of us have our fair share of challenges. But the question is, collectively, how does the EU want to relate to the rest of the world? Will the EU exercise leadership for the global trading system? Or will the EU be so wrapped up in its own internal challenges that it becomes isolated in its own problems? The EU has a chance to exercise leadership, even in Asia. As we speak, the EU has on its hands at least 3 free trade agreements with Japan, Singapore, and Vietnam. On one level, these free trade agreements are an expression of our desire to lower the barriers to trade. But that is just on one level. On a more significant level is whether the EU sees itself working with Asia to integrate our production and value chains in order to leverage on each other's relative comparative advantages. That this is a statement of our collective determination to come together to leverage on the best from each other. So we hope that the EU-Singapore FTA will soon get its way through the European Parliament. We will learn how to navigate this carefully and shepherd the process through the European Parliament. But we hope that we will never lose sight of the fact that these free trade agreements investment protection agreements are not just about lowering barriers to trade, but more significantly about the EU statement to the rest of the world of how it wants to integrate and connect with the rest of the world and to leverage on each other's relative comparative advantage to bring our respective economies to a higher plane. Likewise, Brexit or not, the UK has to answer those same questions. How will the UK relate to the rest of the world? Especially in Asia, where the UK, and together, collectively with the European countries, have a significant presence in Asia. And as we were saying, you'll be a shame for either the UK or the European community to walk away from this leadership position. Let me touch on the third set of issues that we will have to confront today, and that is Asia's relevance in the new emerging global order. I can safely and confidently say that no one in Asia wants to choose sides, although some may feel that they have no choice but to choose sides. No one wants to see the world being balkanized into different trading blocs, where you are either with me or not with me. Everyone in Asia wants to see a more integrated global community. And the question is, how can Asia do this against the backdrop of what's happening between the US and China and the posture that the EU wants to take? Asia will need to strengthen our efforts to create relevance. To create relevance regardless of what is happening between the US and China. Asia cannot be looking for the spoils of war, as they say, but instead it has to create relevance by once again redoubling our efforts to integrate our economies. Once again, to leverage on each other's relative comparative advantages, to bring out the best in each other. And this is the reason why the CPTPP, the ongoing RCEP negotiations, the ASEAN Economic Community, and all these efforts are so important. All these efforts speak to the same urgent need for us to integrate our economies rather than to choose sides or to fragment our global and regional production and value chains. For example, the growing digital economy is a tremendous opportunity for economies in Asia and the rest of the world to come together. It is an opportunity for greater integration. But if we don't seize that opportunity, then we also risk balkanization into digital islands, isolated digital islands, which contradicts the very essence of data and digital flows to bring about a more integrated world. And this is where Asia, together with like-minded partners in Europe, America, and elsewhere, must come together to evolve the WTO system beyond that taking care of the traditional, conventional goods and services sector, to look at what are the new rules we require for the digital economy, to enable the digital economy to grow, flourish, and integrate. So these are the three sets of challenges that we have to confront today. How the US and China relate to each other and thereby exercising their leadership for the global system. How the EU and the UK decide on its priority for the day after Brexit, with or without Brexit. how Asia come together to create relevance for itself. So on that note, I'll be happy to hear your views, share thoughts, and then perhaps we can all, in our respective circle of influence, help to bring about a more integrated world that will bring out the best in each of us for the good of our people. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much. Thank you for eloquently outlining the key challenges, the three key challenges as you see them. I want to touch on the first initially. President Trump, President Xi are due to meet in Argentina on the sidelines of the G20 in just over a week. Most aren't optimistic that there'll be any breakthrough. Are you expecting any material breakthrough in the tensions between the US and China over the course of the next week?
I won't hold my breath. And the reasons are as what I have said. We can't look at the US-China relationship in isolation. We can't look at the US-China trade relationship in isolation. To resolve some of the contradictions in the trade relationship, we have to look deeper to resolve some of the more fundamental contradictions in the respective economies. And unless and until we manage some of those underlying contradictions, it will be hard for both US and China to come to a quick resolution. We all look forward to a quick resolution because it provides certainty for the world. And I think the greatest damage is the uncertainty cost, rather than where it finally lands. And I think as business people, all of you will want a predictable environment. And that's what we all hope for. But we also hope that both the US and China can put their relationship in the broader perspective. That it is not just about bilateral interests, which of course are important, that there are also global leadership interests that both of them have to exercise as the largest economies in the world.
Given it seems unlikely there's going to be any short-term resolution, and given this could be protracted and the uncertainties you touched on.
I hope I'll be pleasantly surprised.
And I think many would agree. What is the greatest risk? Is it to growth? Is it countries choosing sides, as you mentioned earlier, and therefore going down a path that may not be long-term beneficial?
I think there are a couple of risks. First, if uncertainty leads to businesses withholding their investment decisions, then I think there will be quite serious implications on the world economy. And as many financial analysts would say, we are in the late cycle of the financial markets. If this coincides with a loss of investors' confidence globally, then we might be in for a rough ride. So this is one set of risks that we have to manage. The other, as you have mentioned, is that will we end up seeing a fragmentation of the global production and value chain? I think the world is a much better place if we can leverage on each other's comparative advantage. And that's the basis of trade. Today, for any secondary, tertiary products, it's hard-pressed to say that this is produced entirely in country X. You take out any of the smartphones that we have in our pockets. I always like this story. The MIT did a study. Can anyone produce the iPhone entirely within its geographical boundaries? The answer is, well, yes, not impossible. Today, this is the price of the iPhone. If you try to onshore everything, this will be the price of the iPhone. But even if you try to onshore everything, you don't have all the necessary raw materials to do so. And if you want to find substitute to all the necessary materials, then the price will be here. So is the world better for that? I'm not so sure. Yeah. So I think if we look at it logically, the global mega trend is towards greater integration. But having said that, whether is it the US, the Chinese, or the Europeans, we all have to manage the domestic challenges that comes with global integration. Because it requires businesses to evolve. It requires workers to be retrained so that they can get onto new businesses, take on new jobs. But this is easier said than done.
Yes, yeah.
And unless every country has the political will and the political capacity to make some of these internal adjustments, we will find ourselves having a great idea, but unable to benefit from it fully because we can't reconcile the domestic challenges.
So we are looking at possibly a generation of uncertainty, because these domestic challenges are not insubstantial for China and the US, and the knock-on effects of not resolving the dispute could go on for years.
It depends on whether you are optimistic or pessimistic.
And what do you...
Let's take the EU as an example. Let's take the EU as an example. I was studying in the UK when the European experiment came on some 30 years back. At that point in time, I vividly remembered few, if any, of my professors in Cambridge ever gave the EU any chance of success. And there are good economic logic why the EU shouldn't have survived for so many years. And the fundamental question was, how can you have an integrated market without an integrated fiscal policy, an integrated monetary policy, a coherent labor movement, labor mobility policies? So you can criticize the EU for all you want, but you must admit that the EU has succeeded beyond the wildest imagination of my professors. And, you know, and now if my professors, if they're still around, and they look at Brexit, and they could have easily turned around and say, I told you so. But those are inherent challenges, just to take the EU and UK as an example. In the UK, why is it the vote for Brexit is so low in London, whereas the vote for Brexit is so much higher in some of the Midlands places? And that's because London has been a beneficiary of that integration with EU and that integration with the global economy. But some other places in the Midlands and elsewhere may not have benefited as much. They may have benefited, but they may not have benefited as much. And that is a challenge. And many in the Midlands will have to be reskilled to take on new jobs. And it's not easy. And if any country cannot resolve some of these internal challenges, you will always be faced with a bigger issue of how and if you can even talk about that politically to your domestic audience.
Yes.
As someone says, all politics is local.
Yes.
So I'm not entirely pessimistic that you will last a generation. By the way, nowadays it's very hard to say how long is a generation. In the internet world, a generation can be a few years.
Yes.
Perhaps in our generation can mean generations. But it depends also on politics, whether the respective political systems have the political will, courage, and capacity to take on some of these challenges. Even for Singapore, as a small, open economy, we have our fair share of challenges. We do not believe in protecting the jobs, but we believe in protecting the workers. We believe that it is not enough just to place today's unemployed into today's job, nor is it sufficient to place today's unemployed into tomorrow's job. Our grand goal, grand vision, is to place tomorrow's unemployed into tomorrow's jobs ahead of time. Easier said than done. because you need to convince people to change. You need to convince businesses to evolve ahead of time. And it's human nature for us to ask, why should I get out of my comfort zone and be ready for the future ahead of time, especially when the future is uncertain? But unless and until we can do that well in our respective countries, there will be a pushback towards this idea that we will all benefit from global integration. And I think people can understand that those benefits that come from global integration. It's just how you overcome some of these domestic issues.
Okay. The Minister's keen to hear from you, your questions, your comments. Please put your hand in the air and we'll bring around a microphone. I'll just ask one question as people prepare their thinking. Martin, I will get to you. You talked about the relevance of Asia. Have you found, do you get a sense that your neighbours are now more keen for integration, say with ASEAN, in terms of ASEAN economy, and to embrace multilateral deals because of the tensions of US and China? Is it driving, is it accelerating integration and cooperation?
Certainly.
Yeah.
I sense that, and this is why this year during our chairmanship of the ASEAN and our chairmanship of the RCEP process, you see the greater urgency demonstrated by all the 16 partner countries to want to conclude the RCEP as soon as possible, notwithstanding the differences in our level of aspirations. I think every one of my counterparts understand that the RCEP is not just about lowering of tariffs, it's not just about harmonizing our rules, but more importantly, it is about allowing our businesses, our economies to be much more integrated, to leverage on each other's relative comparative advantage.
Okay, let's turn over to questions. I think, Sherwood, you had your microphone, please, just here at the front. Thanks.
Minister, thank you very much for your comments. Could I ask you about your government's view of the Belt and Road Initiative? I was in Washington recently, and it's difficult to overstate the antipathy, particularly in the White House, towards Belt and Road. I work for a bank, HSBC, which is very committed to helping China going out, being part of that story, and I wondered what your view was for the government of Singapore.
We see the Belt and Road Initiative as a natural development of the Chinese economic trajectory. 40 years ago, Deng Xiaoping made the decision to open up the Chinese economy, but not just to open up the Chinese economy, but to integrate the Chinese economy with the world's economy. Since 2-3 years back, FDI into China has been exceeded by ODI out from China. China has reached a stage of development whereby it will have to grow by going out of China. And it's a positive development for China and for the world. So it is a natural trajectory that we should all expect, that China will increasingly want to invest beyond its shores. And China would also want to secure its own supply chains and lines of communications. So that is to be expected. Then the question is, how does it work? I don't think there's any problem with what President Xi Jinping has enunciated as a vision for greater integration, for the benefits to spread to the region. The question is one of execution. All projects, be it Belt and Road or non-Belt and Road projects, will be best executed if it maintains a market discipline. Evaluate each project on its own through the market lenses and execute it through the market mechanism. But if the people executing this decides to add in all kinds of non-economic considerations, then I think they do injustice to President Xi's vision. And they will then create a lot of misunderstanding to the intent of President Xi's vision. Many of these projects are long-term projects. They require stability, they require the rule of law, they require us to give confidence to the investors. And if you look at Asia's demands for infrastructure projects, is tremendous. So it is a good coincidence of interest, but execution is key. 1/3 of all Chinese Belt and Road investments come through Singapore. They don't come to Singapore, but they come through Singapore. Why do they come through Singapore? Because Singapore offers our experience and expertise in the areas of legal and financial syndication. It provides investors the confidence, the rule of law, the platform to reach out to third-party countries. And this is how Singapore works with China. And so long as we maintain market discipline in each and every of the Belt and Road projects, I think it will benefit China, it will benefit the region and the respective economies. But having said that, I must say this. Every Belt and Road project is a joint responsibility between the investor and the recipient countries. Both needs to exercise good judgment on the economic viability of the project. It is not China's responsibility alone.
Next question, please. Martin, I think you had your hands in the air. Yes. There. Okay. Natalie, yeah, please. Microphone over here, thank you.
Thank you very much. Natalie Black, the UK government's new Trade Commissioner for Asia Pacific, based here in Singapore. Thank you very much, Minister, for your very thoughtful remarks. I enjoyed them immensely. One of the questions I wanted to ask was around CPTPP. The UK government has been vocal in our interest in potentially joining. How do you think that will be received here? But also, how would an application from us compare to other countries that might be interested?
Realistically, at this point in time, the CPTPP is going to enter into force at the end of the year, on the 30th of December. I think realistically, at this point in time, the countries involved, the 11 countries involved, will be very focused on getting the machine going. And there are, besides the UK, there are many other countries that express interest to join the CPTPP. For Singapore, we see it as a positive development because this fits into the wider posture that we would like to see, that countries are working together for greater integration rather than fragmentation. So as and when the system is ready, as and when UK is ready, I'm quite sure the countries will welcome discussions with the UK, just as we welcome discussions with any other countries that express interest to join the CPTPP.
Next question. Stephen, please.
Your Excellency, you've talked about the increasing integration of ASEAN. I wonder if you would share any views you have on lessons learned by ASEAN from the EU experience of things not to do on the road towards integration.
ASEAN is quite different from EU. The way ASEAN works is also quite different from EU, right? And that's because of history, that's because of the maturity of the institutions that you have versus the ASEAN. If EU is here, despite all its imperfections, the institutions in ASEAN are relatively less developed. And ASEAN also work on a slightly different basis of a consensus building. So you will find that in ASEAN, the level of development between the 10 different countries are also more disparate compared to perhaps the EU. But both face the same challenges. As the EU become bigger, the level of this development between different EU member states will also become more disparate. The interests will also become more disparate. What are some of the lessons we can learn? Number one, We can only all move at the pace which everyone is comfortable with, right? Sometimes less haste, more speed. So this is one. But there's another lesson to be learned. That if you can't get everyone together, sometimes it's good to allow those who are more ready to do a pathfinder way forward. And then that allows others to build confidence and come on board and join. So I think these are common lessons learned, whether is it for EU or for ASEAN or for any regional arrangements. But one of the things that we must always bear in mind is that just because the level of development is more disparate doesn't mean that it's more difficult for us to work together. Because, again, as an economist, we always believe in the theory of comparative advantage. It doesn't mean that we must all be the same for closer collaboration and integration to happen. What it means is that we must each understand our relative strengths and weaknesses and see how we complement one another. And that, I think, will be the key to us all moving faster together.
We're almost out of time, so if you don't mind, I'll ask just a couple more questions. You're part of the new generation of leadership in Singapore. How does Singapore position itself? Does it need to slightly reinvent itself in these extraordinary uncertain times? Is that around technology, which you touched on in your speech? Or does Singapore see itself as a leader in the region during these uncertain times?
Singapore will always have to reinvent ourselves every generation, every few years, if not every year, if not every day. We have never taken for granted our existence. Never. For those students of history, you will know that Singapore has never been allowed to be independent over the last few hundred years. The last 53 years has been an aberration in history. For us to be independent, it takes tremendous effort. For us to create relevance to the world. The world is a harsh place. It is neither charitable nor sympathetic to small states. And the history of city-states in the history of mankind has not been easy. The question for Singapore, be it 1965 or 2065, is fundamentally this. How do we survive and thrive without a conventional hinterland? We have done that reasonably well over the last 53 years by connecting to the world. Connectivity to us is not an option nor a choice. It is our way to survive. In the last 53 years, connecting well to the rest of the world through the air, land, and sea dimension has allowed us to transcend our geography and not be circumscribed by neither our geographical size or location. We see the world as our hinterland rather than just the physical space around us. Going forward in the next 50 years, the challenge will be similar. But we are confident, because the world has changed, that beyond connecting through the air, land, and sea dimensions, we will connect through 4 other non-physical dimensions: data, finance, talent, and technology. If we can do this well across all the 7 dimensions, then we will effectively grow the Singapore hinterland, that we are part of a global system, not just a regional system. Which is why connectivity and integration is so important to the survival of small states like Singapore. In the realm of data and finance, physical size is no longer a limitation. And that allows us to transcend our conventional limitations. So we are quietly confident. But in order for us to seize those opportunities, as you have suggested, we will have to constantly reinvent ourselves. And it goes back to how I was sharing that we have to prepare our workers and companies for the competition ahead of time. We have done well in the last 53 years, in no small part to the fact that we are prepared to take the hard decisions to help our companies and people adjust ahead of time. We have a unique system in Singapore called tripartism, to have the government, the business, and the labor movement working closely together to enable our businesses to transform ahead of time, to equip our workers with the skills ahead of time. We never take this for granted. We constantly nurture this relationship. And we learn this from some of the Nordic countries, some of the Northern European countries. We learn it from them, we adapt it, and we continue to nurture it. So the new world of technology will present many opportunities for Singapore. So if you look at a conventional vertical manufacturing, we will never be able to compete with the Chinese and the Indians in terms of price or size or the scale of operations. But we compete on the basis of the quality of our products, the innovation of our system, and the assurance that we can give people. So in the lingo of the advanced manufacturing sector, we are into the high mix, low volume, high trust, high assurance sphere. And this is how Singapore has to continuously look for niche areas for us to create relevance to the global economic system, to the global production chain. And if we can stay focused and constantly challenge ourselves to do this, there's absolutely no reason why we can't continue the trajectory that we have been on. And our determination is to make sure that we continuously reinvent ourselves to be relevant to the world and to keep this dream of ours to be an independent country, not just surviving, but also thriving, and keep this dream going.
Just finally, the Straits Times and its website is running a piece that there will be an announcement tomorrow on new leadership positions in Singapore. Can we expect something tomorrow?
Well, if the Straits Times say we are expecting something tomorrow, then we must be expecting
You're
something
confirming it.
tomorrow. Well, as we were walking in Singapore, our leadership model is one of continuity, and I think we can all expect that. That the way we do business and the way we relate to the world is that we provide a certain predictability, a certain continuity to how we do things. There are artificialities when people divide up the leadership into different generations, but there are also similarities that cut across each and every generation. And we have been fortunate in Singapore, not because we think that we have leaders who are cleverer than others, but we would like to pride ourselves that we have a leadership model that is stronger than the sum of the individual parts. In everywhere in the world, there are many clever people who aspire to be in leadership positions. But the crux of it is always this. What is the purpose? What's the goal for you to be in the leadership position? Is it for yourself, or is it for the greater good of the country and its people? Countries that do well are those that are fortunate enough not just to have good individuals, but to have a strong team. A strong team that put aside the individual interests, but for the collective aspirations for the country. And in Singapore, we are proud to say that for the last 53 years, we have been able to find a leadership team or leadership teams that have been able to abide by this DNA and this set of ethos. And I think the younger generation of leaders similarly focused on this, building the strongest team for Singapore to ensure that every generation of Singaporeans can continue this dream of ours to stay sovereign, independent, successful. That for each generation of Singaporeans, our definition of success is not how well we do for ourselves, but how well we enable the next generation to do even better for themselves. And that is how we will continue to take this country forward.
Minister, with that, we have to leave it. Please join me in thanking Minister Chan Chun-sing. Thank you very much. That was tremendous. Thank you so much. Please. Oh, sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me again in thanking Minister Chan Chun-sing. All right, moving on now. And US President Trump and China's President Xi, as we know, will meet on the sidelines of the G20 in Argentina in just over a week from now. And there are very few signs of any easing in tension over trade. Indeed, the rhetoric seems to be ramping up, and there's little optimism that there will be any meaningful breakthrough in the trade dispute. The verbal sparring between the two superpowers has escalated with the failure of the APEC summit to deliver a communique and the barbed exchanges which have followed a clear measure of the gap between the two sides. This morning, the Straits Times leads, in its hard copy paper anyway, on the US claims that China has not only continued its so-called unfair trade practices, but has in fact stepped them up. They're harsh and highly critical words, indicating, I believe, that the US is not likely to adjust its position at the meeting between the two leaders. The trade war poses a risk to world growth and to individual nations, as you heard the Minister just say. Only last week, Singapore's Prime Minister warned that ASEAN nations may be forced to choose sides between the US and China, and you just heard Minister Chan say the same thing. Earlier this month, former US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson warned that if the two countries cannot reach a deal, an economic iron curtain could divide the world. They're extraordinary words to use. So these predictions are dire. They have enormous ramifications for Asia and the rest of the world, and they are the subject of our first panel discussion this morning. So let me please welcome our guests who are on the stage. Dr. Wang Huiyou, founder and president of the Center of China and Globalization. Steve Okun, senior advisor, McClarty Associates. Anne Ruth Harkis, who's former Secretary of State at the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, where she led Germany's global trade interests and EU and WTO trade negotiations. Anne Ruth is also on the board of Asia House. Luong Hong Tai, Director General of the Multilateral Trade Policy Department, the Ministry of Commerce of Vietnam, and he's heavily involved in Vietnam's negotiations on CPTPP. And Dr. Robert Koopman, Chief Economist of the World Trade Organization. Please join me in thanking our speakers. Well, thank you all for being here. A lot to talk about. There was a time, most of my career has been in journalism, where trade stories barely got a mention. They're now front page news, to use old media words. It dates me, I'm afraid. Front of the websites, all over Twitter. Trade is a core part of the global debate. Let me start with you. Firstly, this meeting next week, there's a lot of focus on it. Do you expect any breakthroughs between President Xi and President Trump?
Thank you, Chair. It's really great to come back to Singapore. As we just heard the Minister talking about Singapore as such an attractive place, and it was actually my second time in 1 month. I was in the New Economy Conference Bloomberg was organized 2 weeks ago. I think it's really a great sign that President Xi and President Trump are meeting in Argentina, because it's a high-level meeting. It has been, since the telephone conversation between President Xi and President Trump, I think that both leaders are expecting this important meeting, and also that unusually they are actually having a dinner after the meeting, which in a country, in a third country, neither U.S. or China. So I think that this is really a positive sign. I think it will really probably set the tune for a great framework, and I think that the working team that of both countries will work on that. And so hopefully that we are looking for some kind of possibility and peace, calm down of current really the trade tariff escalation. So that's my best hope.
You're hoping, you're relatively optimistic. Steve Oak, let me turn to you. Do you think of any breakthrough at this meeting?
No. Next question.
Could you elaborate?
First, I want to just say to my fellow Americans, I know I see a couple of you there, happy Thanksgiving.
Yes.
I think, growing up in Chicago, I didn't think I'd be at a UK-based organization in Singapore talking about China on Thanksgiving, but welcome to the era of Xi and Trump. Right? No, there's going to be no breakthrough. And there isn't, because what I think people are missing the point is, I get all these questions all the time, right? Doesn't President Trump realize tariffs are just a tax on the U.S. consumer? Doesn't President Trump realize when he's going to stop FDI into the U.S., he's hurting U.S. business? He doesn't care, right? That's not the issue. The issue is that the U.S. has recognized that our consensus for the past 20 years or so, maybe 25 years, of accommodating and engaging China on trade and economics is over. That we can debate whether it was a failure, whether it was a mistake, whether it was the right thing to do, and it's just time to end. But that period of accommodation and engagement is over. And that is because the U.S. on the substance, read President Trump's Twitter feed. It's very important to read that, but you also need to read the substance. Right? This week, the USTR came out with a 53-page report showing that China continues, right, to violate many of its commitments to ensure that there's forced technology transfers, to engage in cyber theft and cyber crimes against the United States and U.S. businesses, to continue to block what should be lawful FDI into China. And until that changes, there isn't going to be a difference between where President Trump's rhetoric is now and where the substance is. So I don't see any framework coming into place unless the two sides start to negotiate what really needs to be negotiated. And the minister made this in his second point this morning, and he said that one of the second biggest challenge, or the second challenge that China is facing, is moving from a state-led economy to a market-driven economy. And I would urge all of you to read Made in China 2025, the Chinese document that came out, a few years ago, where China was going to say that it was going to dominate the 10 most important industries in the 21st century. That hasn't changed, and they were going to do that through state subsidies. That hasn't changed. So until there's a discussion about how China is going to transform from a state-led economy to a market-driven economy, and how the U.S. and the West and the East are going to be part of that discussion, I don't see any change happening regardless of a dinner between the two presidents in Argentina.
Okay. And let's turn to you, because the U.S. position, or the Trump position towards Europe, has changed over the last 12 months. There was lots of tough talk on U.S. and trade issues with Europe. But now the U.S. seems to be gathering its allies around in a sort of anti- or counter-China move. What's the European reading of the Trump-China situation right now? How long will this play out?
I think the EU is realistic enough to assume that we're in a long game here. We have, and certainly my country has changed its attitude towards China trading and investing in Germany to the degree that we are more cautious. We would probably underwrite what my US colleague said, that China hasn't given way in terms of how it prevents a level playing field to come into existence, and it has also not given way in terms of all the intellectual property issues and others. However, going for full blown out trade friction in a world that is as interdependent as ours is obviously not a very smart move. Those of us that depend on the global economy, and certainly Europe does, will have to counter the effects of those of the imbalances that will be created by a continuous trade friction and trade war. And I think our efforts should be directed towards understanding what will happen to supply chains globally, how we preserve trade efficiencies, how we preserve growth, and how we preserve a balance of interaction that we all know we benefit from. Whether we will be able, and the EU as such, I don't think currently is in a position to leverage much weight with the United States, but possibly jointly with ASEAN, the EU, Canada, perhaps Mexico, and other big trading partners will together be able in the G20 to muster sufficient energy to tell the two countries that they need to change the way they deal with each other.
Long Hong Tai, let's look at the Vietnam situation. There are advantages, at least in the short term, are there not, for Vietnam and similar countries in this dispute between China and the US? How are you positioning yourself?
Yes, of course, there have been a lot of talk about, some of the ASEAN countries being there and can be beneficiary to the current frictions that are happening. But we don't think that the frictions would be good for anyone. For example, we have a recent study by the World Bank that with what's happening, and then with the US increasing the tariffs, people tend to think that Vietnam would be the beneficiary in terms of increasing our export. But the study pointed out that all the goods that Vietnam can export that are now subject to tariffs from the US, covering only about $2.3 billion US. And what's worse is that the demand, either in the US, in China, or as well, may be decreasing as a result of the trade friction, and that more than offset what we would gain from the friction. So like most others, we would hope that if they cannot solve all the frictions, at least we hope that by G20, we see at least people will be sitting down together to start talking. We tend to agree with some others that it is a long game, but at least we hope that in order to solve the frictions, at least people have to sit down, talking, and that's what we hope.
Okay. Robert Koopman, I do want to talk to you a little later about WTO itself, but first, the impact of the trade tensions, trade war on growth. OECD's put out a report with some quite tough warnings. I think JP Morgan put something out overnight or yesterday. It's going to hit growth, isn't it?
Yeah, so our analysis, we've already revised our trade forecast downward, but it's a revision downward. It's not a decline in trade.
Yeah.
It's slowing trade. And we think that the direct effects of the policies that have been announced so far are causing a drag on trade growth and some direct effect on economic growth in general. Our bigger concern is, as the minister pointed out, the increasing uncertainty that comes from this kind of environment. And will that uncertainty affect investment behavior and consumer behavior? And we start to see indications that investment decisions are indeed being adversely affected around the world. We hear that Chinese consumers are starting to hold back on some of their consumption growth. Those kinds of things would end up having much bigger effects on overall economic growth and trade growth than just the direct effects of the policies. I think our bigger concern is if this current trade conflict truly becomes a world where we have non-cooperative trade outcomes, then the effects are very, very large, much larger than what the World Bank, IMF, the WTO has been saying. And that adversely affects everybody. The current skirmishes, we do think, will have some indirect positive spillovers to other countries as supply chains realign, and we do see some of that. It was happening anyway, by the way. Outward FDI, as was mentioned, from China was growing pretty significantly. And supply chains are very flexible in this modern world of technology. They do need to have good rules, regulations, frameworks to be able to adjust within. So that uncertainty could start spilling over into that area. That could cause big negative effects on adjustment.
So Steve Okun, the global economic consequences, not just of the slowdown in trade, but the increased uncertainty and contraction in consumer demand, pretty dire. So is that a factor being built into US policy, or is the US just determined to charge through and drive change?
Well, I think there's a consensus that accommodate and engage when it comes to China is over. The question of what's next, does it become contain and isolate, or is it something less than contain and isolate, is what's going to lead to the consequences, the dire consequences that could happen if the US were to really go forward with a contain and isolate. And I think that is where you're having the real debate in Washington right now. You're having the real debate in the Trump administration, and you see the Navarro and Lighthizer and Kudlow's and Pence all engaged in this. I mean, I think the hopeful aspect, certainly the hopeful aspect from the business community, is that we come to something less than contain and isolate. I mean, as the business community, we would say the number one mistake the Trump administration made when it came to its China policy was pulling out of CPTPP on day 3 of the administration. The business community still urges the U.S. to come back. We urge the U.S. to be doing more. The U.S. is trying to do more in integration. I mean, the BUILD Act, partially in response to BRI bringing $60 billion in is all of that. So I'm not as pessimistic, and I'm hopeful that there can be an accommodation between the U.S. and China, that China recognizes that it does need to move to more of a free market economy. It has to do so within its reality, but it does need to move in that direction. That the old days of basically Boeings and beans is going to end, where China commits to buying Boeings and soybeans, and the trade deficit comes down for a year or two, and everything's going to be fine. I think those days are over. So we're in a period of volatility, but I don't think it's going to be a dire end.
Okay. Dr. Wing, do you get any sense from Beijing that China is looking at making the adjustments to the so-called unfair trade practices, that it will give some ground? Because clearly the US is asking for concessions.
Yes, I think that it's a really great debate. Also, it serves as a wake-up call to both countries and the world as well. I think, first of all, this year is actually happened to be the 40 years anniversary of China opening up. And also, it's the 40 years anniversary of China-US diplomatic ties established. So in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping just November, when he finished the 11th, third plan of 11th Congress, Party Congress, next month he went to the United States in January and they established diplomatic ties. So you see, the opening actually was quite open to U.S., to the Western world. It's really great for the last 4 decades. China has achieved enormously, all the multinationals in China, Fortune 500 in China, and U.S. company in China. Now, Apple, GM, Ford, and those big multinationals. GM actually, Ford, is selling more cars in China than in the United States. Let's talk about some statistics. I think China is trying to make a lot of progress. Of course, China joined WTO, and WTO allowed China as a developing country status. Of course, that, for the last 70 years, China has grown, really developed. And then now I think the problem is that maybe we need to reform WTO. And also the other thing is that I would say that the business companies, particularly from the US, have made enormous inroads in China. They have actually, every year, they make about 500 billion revenues, $500 billion US dollar revenue in China. The trade deficit is only 370 billion. It's much larger than the trade deficit. Again, this is also a tri-party issue because President Trump, put tariffs on China, but they're actually hurting most of the U.S. companies. Half of the China export was really made by the, U.S. companies. middle products. All this. I mean, a good example is that, when President Trump announced tariff reduction, Apple announced they're going to wire back, repatriate $250 billion. They make $50 billion a year in China. So I think, same is true probably for the GM, for Ford, for GE, for, Walmart, all the rest of companies. So the problem is not just China. If the US company put in their money outside China, not make America great again, they should also take some responsibilities too. So I think that it's really a multifaceted issues. I think China now is just last month, this month, China put up the largest import-export in the world ever happened. 4,000 companies came, and President Xi announced that they're going to buy, China going to import 30 trillion in the next 10, 15 years. So it's enormous. And so what I see the problem is that China has also voluntarily reduced the auto tariff by half already. China has issued the credit card for the American Express, the license. China is, Tesla is setting up 100% ownership plant in China. BMW is setting a 75% control share in China. I heard something today that Daimler Chrysler is also doing something. So there's a lot of happening. China is still actually making progress, but maybe not enough as U.S. expected. But that's precisely, I think, we need to talk. President Xi is willing to talk, and Trump is talk. And that's probably the solution.
So your sense is that there is a willingness in China to make concessions, but it's the pace at which those concessions can be made, which is one of the thorny issues.
I think there's a willingness of both sides to make progress. If President Trump said they would like to talk, and President Xi is willing to talk, it's a great sign that the diplomatic of the head of state is really important. I mean, also business is concerned. I mean, the U.S. business just 2 weeks ago, there's 300 or 400 business people gathered in Singapore at the New Economy Conference on Bloomberg. So we're talking a whole day about China. If China is not that relevant, I mean, why everybody is so concerned? So it's already part of the global chain. If you cut this part off, it's going to really hurt the world. I mean, the Booking has actually made some forecast. If there's a 10% tariff, the world economy is going to be hurt by 1 to 4%. If it's 40%, we're going to have another recession. So I think the tariff is not the way to go back. I mean, let's do the multilateral, let's do the talks and maybe WTO reforms and RCEP, CPTPP, all those things. Let's work this together on that.
CPTPP, Mr. Tai, has come up several times in this conversation already. Is it of even more strategic importance now than ever before, given the escalating tension? Is that a sense you get, because you're involved in the discussions, negotiations in CPTPP, is there a realization that that is now becoming something of a beacon of multilateralism, and it's important that not only succeeds, that it thrives?
Yes, that's, you look at the coming into force provision of the CPTPP, it says that at least 6 countries ratifying it and it become effective. Instead of the TPP, which says 2 years. The reason why is because people trying to show that yes, in all the frictions, at least we have some rules and we want to prove that the rules are working for some people. And we hope that this is something that we at least can create something as a forum for people to be engaged. So you are right that the CPTPP is something that we are trying to do in a little bit quicker because of what is happening.
And is there an appetite in the CPTPP group to add other countries, the UK, which has expressed an interest in looking at it? Is there, again, not only a willingness but enthusiasm for expanding membership?
Officially, we cannot say now because we need to wait for the UK until after March next year before they can officially engage.
But before officially.
But I think there have been a lot of people reaching out, starting talking, sensing how should we go from here. Of course, there are a lot of uncertainties now, and trade negotiations sometimes take a long time. So many people hope that we can finish a trade agreement in a few months, for example. But to be practical, most serious trade negotiations take years rather than a few months.
And Ruth, I want to turn to the WTO, and Robert, I'll come to you in just a moment, but it is in need of reform, is it not? And you dealt with the WTO in your previous role. Is there a possibility that that reform can happen quickly enough to help resolve and diffuse some of the issues that we have at the moment?
Well, we would hope that the WTO has the power, the guts, and the will to reform itself. However, knowing how international organizations work, create consensus, and push policy, it is probably a very long game. And the partners that actually drive the WTO are too disparate to create the momentum to do that. So I'd rather come down on the side of saying, let's hope that together with ASEAN, the EU, the WTO, and other international organizations will form consensus around preserving the global multilateral system of fair rule and fair trade, including promoting acceptable, transparent standards, rather than hoping that the WTO is a very complex organization will be able to reform. But all hands up for that organization to deal with the current situation.
Robert, neat segue to you. Is there an appetite within the WTO for reform?
Oh, definitely. But the appetite varies depending on the members.
Yeah.
And it is a members' discussion. I want to clarify that we on the Secretariat are member-led organizations. We provide information and analysis that helps them with their discussions. But there is, I think, a growing momentum to have a deep discussion around reform. And much of that is around issues like transparency, the notifications for subsidies, how quick disputes are handled, what's covered in disputes. And these are substantive conversations by major players. I think it's very good. It is a question as to whether or not it will gain enough momentum that all the members will buy into it. But one other thing that's becoming more clear is that the WTO is a more flexible agreement and organization than many people perceive. And I think a lot of the perceptions are derived from post-Uruguay round discussions and negotiations in the Doha round. Much of the success of the WTO has often been like-minded countries finding ways to agree and move forward, and creating an environment where the other countries that aren't ready can join in when they are. And those kinds of discussions have started to permeate again, come back into the discussion, rather than we have to talk about everything all at once and have a big agreement, which, by the way, was not supposed to happen after the Uruguay round. We're looking at ways within the Secretariat, but members also, how to make better use of the regular committee work, where a lot of very good transparency happens. Transparency, by the way, helps contribute to certainty. And I think that's many of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, I think, don't necessarily rise to the public's awareness like a big negotiation, but it's still very important in that day-to-day business. Trade policy reviews, our notification systems, the kinds of discussions on standards and technical barriers at the SPS, TBT committees. There's a lot of good things that still happen. We had the trade facilitation agreement, which we think is going to have bigger net effects than removing all tariffs, if fully implemented. One last thing, if I could say, well, two things. All WTO members live in glass houses. They all have things that they should not be proud of. What I find interesting is often the debate is about trying to accuse the other side of having failures and not acknowledging your own. I think it would be much better if countries would recognize that they all have these sensitive areas, and how do you build some momentum to negotiate forward in those areas. And then, you live in a glass house, you have to find these solutions sometimes elsewhere. So learning from what's happening in other areas of negotiations and reflecting on those and potentially bringing those back to the multilateral system is a very valuable process. At least that's what many of us feel, that there's much to learn from these other negotiations that are going on. And finally, don't try to solve all your economic problems with a trade negotiation. I think one of the concerns that the US administration seems to have about China is it's got a strong and clear economic strategy for economic development. I'm not sure all of those policies involved in that strategy comply with international rules. I don't know. But maybe the US needs to think about its economic development strategy and what has worked for it historically, and has it gotten away from the kinds of things that worked for it. I mean, Minister Chen was talking about regional disparities. These are huge. And you look at the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area versus Detroit. That's not something that's necessarily trade-driven. There's an economic geography challenge that many countries face. You go to Shenzhen, China, it's not a developing city. It's a hyper-competitive, fast-growing, high-income economic region. So trade agreements are about between countries, and yet within countries we see big economic development disparities. How do you deal with those? It's not clear to me that trade agreements are the place to deal with that.
Steve Okun, the US president doesn't seem to be a big fan of the WTO. There's talk of reform, but it's likely to be slow if it happens at all. What's the outlook for the WTO from the sort of US president, US administration's perspective?
Yeah. And I want to tie into what Dr. Wang said as well, because, there's no question that China is critical to US businesses. US businesses are not pulling out of China. US businesses have to be in China. It's going to be, if it's not already, the largest domestic market to serve. And you can't pull your factories out of China and continue to serve China. So that manufacturing is going to stay. Supply chains may shift. You may take some manufacturing that would have been exported out of China into a Vietnam or a Thailand. But that's the challenge, so you have to stay engaged in China, but how are you going to reform China? Because China needs reform. And getting to the WTO point, there's no way that Made in China 2025, with its state subsidies for all of those 10 industries, should be complying under the WTO. Now, and it might be, and that's where the reform needs to get to. And Robert mentioned the state subsidies. And so, yes, the U.S., when it talked at APEC, it said we need to see state subsidies, we need to see transparency, we need to see how we're going to tighten up the definition of non-market, in non-market economies in developing countries. The U.S. is trying to do that on its own, with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, saying that we're not going to allow you to negotiate an FTA, Canada and Mexico, with China. And so it wants the WTO to do that, but if the WTO can't reform, the U.S. is going to go, and it's going to do it on its own. And I'll just say that certainly as an American, we recognize we live in glass houses. We throw stones all the time using, the national security exemption to justify auto parts tariffs would be a stretch, if not an outright breakage of that. And then we're going to get taken to the WTO if we, the United States, do that. So we'll see what happens. So yeah, but so it goes to exactly your point. We want the WTO, but then we don't want it to tell us what to do, right? And so all of this is where the Trump administration is running up into the realities of what the business community needs and what others in government want.
Let's open up now to questions from the audience, please.
Michael, could I make one clarifying comment?
Okay, and we'll come to you, but please, yep.
Okay.
A counter from Robert here. Yeah.
Yes. People talk about, particularly I hear from the U.S., loss of sovereignty due to WTO findings. If there's an adverse finding against you in the dispute settlement process at the WTO, you do not have to change your laws. Many people just don't seem to understand that, particularly in the United States.
Okay.
That's also, I could, I could add a final comment on the WTO. I think that, since Second World War, we had this Bretton Woods system, which has the U.S. led that system, which is a very multilateral approach. I think the way to get out of this trouble is that let's do the multilateral approach. Let's do another round of great trade talks at WTO, but also at, let's say, a regional platform like CPTPP,
Yes.
which is already a low-hanging fruit. It has been agreed by 12 countries, 11 countries. There is on a high level of WTO is regarding the service trade. China actually have, Huawei or Xiaomi or Alibaba or Tencent. All those companies also want service going out. So we have a new level of trade protection or arrangement through this new arrangement. So I think the leadership of the world now is really trying to think out and maybe reach new senses. So I think my recommendation would be that China and the US all come back to CPTPP and then talk about that, and then let's have a new round of a global multilateral agreement. Because unilaterally, bilaterally, sometimes it's not as effective as multilaterally. I remember when China joined WTO, it was a multilateral effort. And then China honored its commitment, trying to honor its commitment, and also abolish thousands of outdated rules and regulations. So the best way to do it is multilateral. It's really, let's get those regional agreement and RCEP and all the CPTPP and WTO work.
Yeah.
Not to really start a unilateral approach.
Question, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Lockney Su. I'm Professor of Law at Singapore Management University. It's a terrifically interesting panel discussion. I have two questions. The first one is directed at the panel in general, and it relates to the idea of using national security. We're seeing a lot of focus in trade and investment regulations now focusing on national security. So for the businesses, they might feel helpless. How do we ensure that that doesn't become a new kind of trade barrier? I mean, there are legitimate arguments on national security, of course, but it could also be become a trade barrier in some way. My second question is directed at Director General Long. With the entry into force soon of the CPTPP, can we look forward to some change in Vietnamese law on the data localization area? Thank you very much.
Let's start with that, and then we'll move on to national security issues. The question was to you on data.
Yes, the CPTPP agreement will come into force for Vietnam on the 14th of January instead of 30th of December like some others. And in the CPTPP agreement, there is some rules on data localization, but it is subject to an exception on national security. So linking that to the first question, so in that context, we also have a new law on cybersecurity, and we are working with the partners on the scope, also the detailed rules in that. And I can tell you that because of the CPTPP, we are now working to narrow down the scope of the cybersecurity law so that it, for example, will not be applying to financial services companies. A lot of services companies will be out of that. So the new draft has taken care of that, but we will continue to be working with some other stakeholders, in particular the international businesses, trying to define national security in the agreement in a sense that it's truly for national security purposes. Thank you.
To the broader question of national security becoming a trade barrier, it sort of is already, isn't it, Steve?
It is to some degree, and I mean, the U.S. has obviously, expanded, the CFIUS review process, and it's inevitable. I mean, again, when you have all of the cyber theft that's occurring, when you have cyber espionage occurring, when you have state-owned companies that can then get those secrets and then bring them in, countries are going to want to block that. So I think there is a growing legitimacy for using national security when it comes to FDI restrictions. The problem is you don't want to then call everything national security to get out of your WTO commitments, like you call steel and aluminum and autos and auto parts. If you start taking in, U.S. law terms, Section 232 exemptions for that, you're going to undermine it. And so I think that's what we want to see, is where there is a growing legitimacy for taking national security into account in FDI, but it can't then become the loophole in which you can, drive trucks through. Dr. Mike.
Yeah, I think we have to ask a fundamental questions. Are we better off compared with 70 years ago? I was just in Paris for the 100 years anniversary of First World and then Second World War. Are we better off 40 years ago? I think precisely because of the trade actually, made the world prosperity and world interconnected. So I'm very dismayed to see that we are tightening the security, we're tightening all those measures, CFIs and European countries, inspection, so that will jeopardize the trade, will jeopardize the investment. If there's no trade, there's no investment, we'll go back to a Cold War. It will go back to the old days. Actually, China, the last 40 years, opened up, has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. We don't want to make China into another North Korea or Iran or anything like that. We want to contribute. And Belt and Road is a contribution to the world. So let's talk. Let's not really tighten the security on each side and then really, if all the Chinese students in the U.S. are spy, that's the end of the world. So I don't think that we should, take that kind of, we should really be more liberalized, repair and upgrade the existing global system, and then actually looking for the better future, rather than let's really shoot each other into the Cold War. I mean, that's really another way to go. And the security is one of the reasons to, probably the excuse to do that.
Yeah, and Ruth?
Yes, I'm not sure it's that easy. First of all, in terms of national sovereignty, I think my American colleague is right by pointing out that national security protection measures with regard to FDI has a growing legitimacy around it. I also believe that there can be a good job done in terms of defining what is national security, what is critical infrastructure, and what does it take for a national economy to preserve its productivity while staying engaged in global supply chain and in global economic activity. I also think that the WTO is certainly helpful in defining these measures, but it makes no sense as long as we cannot wrap our arms around what cyber threats we will have to face in the future and how we counteract cyber criminality or trans-border activities that are poorly understood. We will be going down the road of defining what is national security, what does it take, and how do we protect our national economies.
Robert, final word to you from the WTO's perspective.
Oh, I'm pretty boring on this. There's a case at the WTO, so I really can't talk very much about it. Sorry
yes,
about
you can.
that.
Just come on, informally.
You're not being recorded.
Well, I think, so without the specific issue here, I think national security is being invoked because of concerns around unlevel playing fields, right? And the way an economist in the WTO would look at this is, well, okay, what are the issues? How unlevel is the playing field, and how much is that injuring the other party, right? And then at the WTO, you try to find a way to have an equivalent withdrawal of benefits. And it's not clear to me that the national security provisions as being invoked have anything to calibrate against. So we don't really know how big of an issue is it, how much should you invoke it, and whether or not this is the appropriate kind of quantification process, or is it something existential? I think the US is arguing it's existential. That makes it very difficult then, and they've already argued that it shouldn't be tried to be settled through the WTO dispute settlement process. We see it as a very no-win situation, either way you go. We don't necessarily see it as a positive thing. So it's a political thing. Let's get a political negotiation around it, and let's solve it politically rather than try to stick it into a system that's really not designed to answer it.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'm afraid we have to leave it there because we're out of time. Fascinating conversation. We're going to take a break now and come back with a session on technology, including Kai-Fu Lee, one of the pioneers in artificial intelligence, and also then a discussion on Belt and Road, a key part of this global picture. So we start promptly at 10:30, but please thank my speakers for a fantastic conversation. And we'll see you back here at 10:30. Thanks very much. Thank you very much. Some argue that technology is at the very heart of the trade dispute between US and China. And a key component of technology and the race for supremacy is artificial intelligence. The current view is that the US is the world leader in AI, but the Chinese government has made AI a top policy priority, and appears to be making progress at really a breathtaking pace. The AI race and its impact on the world, from politics and business, jobs and industry, society as a whole, will perhaps be the story of the century, shaping lives of millions, if not hundreds of millions. And we are joined now by one of the pioneers in artificial intelligence. Dr. Kai-Fu Lee is chairman and CEO of Sinovation Ventures, and he really is one of the world's leading thinkers on AI. In his recently published book, AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order, Kai-Fu Lee urges the US and China to accept and embrace the great responsibilities that come with significant technological power. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. Kai-Fu Lee.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And all the premises are actually wrong. US is not clearly ahead in artificial intelligence. China's AI is doing great. AI government's helping, but not fundamental to China's success. And AI is not a zero-sum game. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about. First, what is artificial intelligence? Actually, before I show you the applications, let me talk about fundamentally what it is. Many of you may think artificial intelligence is from science fiction. This sentient being that's close to or surpasses human intelligence. That thing does not exist. We don't know how to build it. What artificial intelligence is a set of very clearly brilliant computer science algorithms that if you take one single domain and feed a ton of data to it, it will do superhuman job for that one domain and that domain only. That is all artificial intelligence is today. Can there be breakthroughs? Possibly, but today we are in the phase of building, implementing, applying, and monetizing that set of technologies. And that is what AI is. So in any problem that can be boiled down to single domain, huge amount of data, then we can produce tremendous value from artificial intelligence. So in terms of applications, and I'll try to use these applications to illustrate my point on where it can be applied, obviously there are multiple areas in which this can be applied. Google search and all the way up to autonomous vehicles are fundamentally propelled by the same set of algorithms I talked to you about. So obviously the first one that we've already embraced is Internet AI. That is, every day we're clicking on Facebook and Amazon, we are willing lab rats that are labeling data for them. We're telling Facebook, this is the kind of article I want to see, and by the way, show them to other people like me. And it gives Facebook an amazing knob that allows them to say, I want to keep showing people things that will deliver a certain objective function. And that function might be more minutes per user. That function might be greater forwarding and therefore virality, or it might be maximize my revenue or profit. Think about a CEO who now has these wonderful knobs they can tweak to maximize business metrics. And that's why internet companies have done so well. And the greatest, most powerful, most valuable AI companies today are the AI companies. Amazon, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, and Tencent. Now the second wave is businesses that make use of AI. Banks, insurance companies, government agencies that have collected a lot of data primarily for archival reasons, now finding themselves sitting on a gold mine that can make use out of that. For example, a bank might use all of its customer transactions to do credit card fraud detection, loan determination, asset allocation, and also showing ads, selling products, targeting the right products to the right customers based on their projected buying patterns and their net worth and so on. So it suddenly makes all that data that used to be a cost center now a gold mine. But let me give you an example here to hopefully clarify the point why AI is so powerful. We have invested in a company that is a loan app. That's not a bank, it's a loan app. What it does is on your phone, you can open the app and ask to borrow, let's say, $500. And it will ask you the same questions that any loan application would ask: name, address, employer, income, and so on. You fill it out, and then it has one additional question that says, upload your data from your phone. Now, before you all get frightened, not all your data, the same data that iOS and Android permit companies like Facebook and Twitter to upload. Nothing more, nothing less. And when that's all uploaded, the AI absorbs all the data you submit, compare it against all the other users it has observed based on whether they returned the loan or defaulted, to make a determination which class you're closer to. So who would like to guess, if you were to step outside of this building and take $500,000 and give it to, let's say, 3,000 people randomly on the street, and you pick 1,000 to each give 500 and say, please pay me back with interest, what default rate do you think you'll get? 80%? 90%? Well, it's Singapore, maybe 60%. But still very high, right? But this loan app has a default rate of 3%. And that illustrates the power of AI. So how does it achieve that? It considers all kinds of things you submitted, things you explicitly provided, and things you implicitly provided, like your contact list. Who's on your contact list? Does your mom match your real mom? How long it took you to type your address? If it takes too long to type your own address, it's likely to be fraud, isn't it? And also, what kind of phone you have, what kind of apps you have, what day of the month is it? Is it before payday or after payday? So it gathers all of these things, and we actually, out of curiosity, it gathers 3,000 things. We looked at the least important feature. So keep in mind, this is not very unimportant, but nevertheless, still a useful signal. It turns out to be your battery level. Your battery level is slightly correlated with your likelihood to return the loan. So if you're someone who has an OCD and plugs the phone all the time, probably pretty responsible. If you're someone who keeps running out, well, it increases the 0.0001 chance you might not get the loan. None of these features dominate, so do not think that it actually uses the information alone to make a decision. It correlates in a 3,000-dimensional space and leading to this final decision, something humans can't possibly do. Now, then we move on to wave 3, and that is using sensors, cameras, and microphones to gather information in the real world that's otherwise transient and lost, and use those to build new applications. Amazon Echo is an example, speech recognition, but cameras are a more interesting example. We read a lot about face recognition, so let me again share with you some recent news from China. There is a very famous singer named Jackie Chung, Zhang Xueyou. Anybody heard of him? You like him? No? Well, he's a very famous singer, about my age, but older singer, very, very famous. People my age really, and maybe a little younger, really like him. And he had these series of 5 concerts in China. And now he has a new nickname. It's called Policeman Chung, because these large stadiums were hooked with cameras for the protection of the safety of those in the concert, because there are too many people. And those cameras are hooked with face recognition, which are connected to the most wanted database, which we don't know how many entries, but might be 100,000. So perhaps 100 people were apprehended, and it turned out about 30 of them were in fact in the most wanted list. So it shows you the kind of, I'm not advocating or denouncing such an application. I'm merely citing a fact that the powerful nature of face recognition has gotten to a stage that it could recognize 100,000. In fact, it can do 3 million faces in 60 frames a second and makes an immediate determination of someone who might match a photograph out of a giant database of 3 million faces. Now, how many of you can recognize 3 million faces, or 300,000, or 30,000? So this, again, shows you the power of AI in this area. Of course, to carry it further, you can have autonomous stores. You can have that looks at not only your face, but your gesture, your intent, what you put in your basket, and then charge you directly. So it will make the future of convenience stores and supermarkets completely human-free. In the wave 4, we go into robots and autonomous vehicles. Robots for agriculture that can selectively water and fertilize based on the growth of each plant, and also pick fruits instead of humans picking them in factories for inspection and eventually for assembly of anything. And in commercial uses, dishwashing, that is, throw everything from the tablecloth and just put it in the machine, they all come out ordered. You want that? It's $300,000. I'll be taking an order. And that's an interesting fact, because all of these will go from the people who are willing to pay for it. A restaurant that will displace maybe 10 dishwashers and get the 300,000 back in 1 year, and after that it's free. So this will basically, in volume and over time, make the robotic capabilities more pervasive. And autonomous driving is also something, is probably the largest app of them all. It will change the way we transport ourselves, our logistics, our delivery. There will be no drivers 30 years from now. Everything will be done autonomously, and that means a great improvement to not just convenience, but also our money, because your car is the worst investment you've made. It's sitting there doing nothing 96% of the time other than depreciating. So we'll have shared vehicles that come just as you need them, that reliably, in a green energy manner, take you or your merchandise from place A to place B reliably. So it's very convenient, it's cost savings, and it's also going to be safer. Because one very critical thing about AI is the more data it gathers, the better it gets. So hopefully this gives you an idea about the 4 waves, each of which will add something like 5+% to our GDP, and maybe displace 5% or so of the workforce. And this is only the beginning. How many waves are there? We don't know. It's like going back 20 years at the internet, onset of internet, and asking how many waves would there be. Probably at the time, I would have told you 4 waves. There are the websites, browser, portals, and search engine. That's all I can tell you. I didn't know at the time that e-commerce, social, online to offline, mobile payment would become as large as they are. So this is only the beginning. Now, as I said, this AI only works on the premise of large amount of data, the more the better, and accurate tagging, ideally outcome-based, not human-labeled, in a single domain, and with a large amount of compute, and with some AI experts to tweak it. So now let's go to the US and China question. One would easily cite that the top AI researchers are all American, some Canadian, some British, but mostly Americans. So how could America not be the world's leader in AI? But I bring up 3 important facts for you to consider that might change your mind. First is that AI is not some secret sauce. AI is a breakthrough, a set of breakthroughs, only one very big breakthrough, and these breakthroughs are well understood and accessible to any country, including US, China, UK, Canada, and so on. These AI scientists have a very open mind to share, so unless there's another breakthrough that is protected, the world is on basically level playing field. The second important thing is that because of this, we've moved from the early stage of the DeepMind kind of company, which is researcher-driven, technology-driven, and then can build any application on the great technologies. PhDs run these companies. But now we're at a stage when it's understood by many people, not with the same depth as the people in DeepMind, but enough to be dangerous, enough to create these applications that I told you about. And that potentially changes the capabilities of companies. And thirdly, AI people are the most open-minded people I know. This, I actually have a little contribution myself. In 1987, when I built the world's first speaker-independent speech recognition system, most of my colleagues in speech didn't believe that it worked as well as my paper showed. So I asked my advisor, Raj Reddy, Turing Award recipient, what should I do? And he said, very simple, open source your code base and give them all the data you used so they can replicate it and build on top of that. And that is the spirit in which computer vision, speech recognition, machine translation continue to build. Because AI, unlike traditional sciences, experiments can be replicated. Same data, same algorithm, always the same results. So people are transparent, open, sharing, and build on each other. So with these three observations, here's where China comes in. China may not be ahead in research. In fact, we can pretty much say US has 11 times more top researchers than China. But that is only valuable if a next breakthrough comes. And that breakthrough is not shared in the open manner. Okay? So for now, let's assume there are no breakthroughs for the next 5 to 10 years. We all want there to be, but let's assume there's not. And there's a reasonable chance there's not, because we saw in the 62 years of history of AI, there was only one breakthrough, and that was 9 years ago. So anyway, so if we're in an era of implementation, well, China is getting pretty good at writing papers. While the top 1,000 researchers are largely American, the top 100,000 actually has 42% who are Chinese. The Chinese products are getting innovative. Without going into details, these three columns represent China as a copycat, China as a worthy competitor building on originally American concepts, but evolving into new their applications. And most recently, in the last 5 years, China as a true innovator. Each of the products under the orange is an original innovative product that doesn't exist in the West. And I don't have enough time to go into them. I can only tell you that they are totally worth about 300 billion US dollars. And to build these great products, China has great entrepreneurs who are tenacious and have built up a very different model for building great companies. The American model is vision-driven, change the world, make it light. The China model is tenacious, winner take all, and make it heavy. What do I mean make it heavy? Well, when you're surrounded with people who might be copycats, who might take your product or feature, I'm not talking about IP theft, I'm talking about just the feature, as Facebook took some of Snapchat's features. That kind of building on each other's strengths that are not IP protected. When you're surrounded by copycats, the only way to win is to build a business that can't be copied. And that is the essence of China's new business model. To give a very quick example, in the US, there's companies like Yelp, but in China, there's Meituan. Meituan as a company built such an incredible, uncopyable capability by delivering, finding a way to deliver food to anyone who wants it from 500 restaurants within 30 minutes for 70 US cents. And when that happens, people's way of eating changes, and they've erected such a high wall that a competitor would have to replicate such an exercise, which costs billions of dollars, and involves 600,000 people paid minimally with high turnover on electrical mopeds and figure out a way to change batteries and AI algorithms that runs on them. So that is how you build impregnable business models. And AI has more funding in China, and Chinese companies with this funding, 48% of the world's AI funding go to China, 38% to the US. So China is benefiting from this money. And here I show 5 companies that Sinovation Ventures, we invested in, and they're worth a total of $21 billion, 5 unicorns in AI. Totally, China has about 18 unicorns in AI. These are all pure plays. I think it's larger than any country as a result of the factors I mentioned. But nothing is as important as the massive amount of data. The right part of the graph here shows different algorithms get different results, but more data is always better. There's no data like more data. This is a very famous phrase spoken in the speech community, spoken by none other than Dr. Bob Mercer, the founder of Cambridge Analytica. But before Cambridge Analytica, he was an esteemed speech recognition researcher that I learned much from. What he did later was something that actually surprised many of us. But in the age of AI, if data is the new oil, then China is the new OPEC. And that means China has more users, 3 times as much as the US on the upper left, but also more usage. Chinese takeouts are 10 times more than US, as I mentioned in Meituan. China's shared bicycle is 300 times more, and China's mobile payment is 50 times more than the US. And that is a very critical component. In fact, China's mobile payment is actually more than China's own GDP. And when you go to China, you'll find very few people accept cash and credit cards. This has many implications. It means for the Western economy, credit cards are taking 2% toll on the whole economy. And that's something that should be reconsidered. That also means it's efficient, faster. New entrepreneurs can make money the first month without waiting to build up the user base. It also means it's turning China's economy from a savings economy to a spending economy, as credit card did for the US, but much faster. And finally, it means this creates so much data, because what data is valuable, more valuable than transaction data? This is much better than browsing, clicking. This is real money out of the pocket, indicating you wanted something so much you paid money for it. And lastly, there is the government support, which I think is very important, but not the most critical factor, because all of the unicorns we funded are privately funded up through their becoming unicorn. Of course, the government now helps a lot of companies, but I think the 18 unicorns, probably 15 would have happened without any government support. So the Chinese government policy is techno-utilitarian. This means Chinese government will let some technology be tried and figure out how to regulate it as it goes along. That is how the mobile payment took place. In the West, there probably would be lobbyists from credit card companies that would say, oh, software companies, they're not safe, there could be hacked, there could be fraud. But Chinese government said, well, let's give Alibaba and Tencent a try, and they proved themselves worthy. Of course, Chinese government is not always totally open door for every technology. Crypto, for example, is not legal in China. And another important thing is the left side shows the State Council document putting AI as a national priority. That actually doesn't put budget into building AI, but it gives a directional point of direction for cities and banks. Banks might be more open to adopting AI. They bought some of our AI software after the State Council document came out. It would cause some cities to say, like Nanjing, would say, we have a lot of good universities. Let's build the world's largest AI park. Zhejiang province would say, autonomous vehicle is important. Let's build highways that help autonomous vehicle. And a new city of Xiong'an is being built with autonomous vehicle in mind. In fact, the downtown of Xiong'an would have 2 layers, pedestrians on the top layer, cars on the bottom layer, thereby avoiding what we saw in Phoenix with the worst case of accident, a car hitting a pedestrian. And that might accelerate the adoption of autonomous vehicle, despite the fact that US is ahead right now. So if we look at where is US and China, I would say that China has come from behind and now roughly caught up and will soon probably slightly lead the US in AI implementation. Even though AI research, US is still ahead. But I do want to close by saying that this is really not a zero-sum game, because the Chinese success does not come at the expense of American companies. The Chinese companies are actually built on a parallel universe, that I think it is an amazing future where AI has arrived, and it's driven by the two AI superpowers, and I hope there's a way the two superpowers can work together to make and take the responsibility and make the world a better place. Thank you.
I checked my phone. I have about a 92% charge, which means
Right.
probably I'm sad and lonely more than anything
Here's
else.
some money.
Fascinating stuff, really, absolutely staggering. But the data question is where China has a huge advantage. In these times of what we term data nationalism, where there's more concern and legislative protection, for want of a better term, around data, does that give China yet another advantage because the regulatory environment allows it to use data?
Well, in terms of if the future becomes where data is more to stay in the border of each country, I think China does have a certain advantage because homogeneous data is more valuable than heterogeneous data. So China, as the world's largest country with the same language and culture, can really build models off of what China has. So that's probably the first part of the answer to your question. I'm not sure if the second part you're suggesting in China a lot of data are pooled, enhanced by the government.
Yeah.
That actually is largely not the case.
Right.
The companies that we have funded, they basically, the key to success is either building your own proprietary data and the outcome-based labeling loop, like the loan company. The loan company built up its data with the VC's money, right? To build that loan company, they raised $10 million, lost it all to people who defaulted them. And then they built a model. Then they raised another $30 million and lost it all again. Each time lowering the default rate, but that data is proprietary to the company. It is not accessible by other companies, and the government does not really take that data and aggregate it in any sense.
Do you see this AI race as part of the broader tensions between the US and China at the moment? Because technology is certainly a key issue for President Trump and the administration.
Yeah, it really, I think it is today.
Yeah.
And I wish it weren't. And the reason it shouldn't be is because it's all open source, ready to be shared. It has the world's academicians with such willingness to help and support each other to build the industry forward. So it seems it's incumbent in the US and China as the world's leaders to take the responsibility, benefit from AI, and face the challenges AI brings and help the rest of the world move forward. That would be, I think, the high road. I think the US government has chosen not to take that direction, which I think is based on some possible misunderstanding about that US has some hypothetical large edge, or that the US researchers actually have ways to protect any new inventions that are made. I think if you actually look at the US, I think the best thing that could be done is to attract more research to help the next research come about with a high likelihood of being shared, and spend our time focused on all the issues that AI brings because I talked about all the positives, all the ways to make money. $17 trillion by PwC estimates in the next 11 years. But we haven't looked at the downside. There are huge issues with privacy, data bias, security, job displacement, monopolies, and wealth inequality. It seems like governments now more than ever need to put their heads together and figure out what needs to be done.
But you've been a strong advocate of policy change ahead of job displacement in particular.
That's, yes, one example.
Are governments taking this seriously?
I think not. I think the displacements, you can just look at what I described. In a single domain, large amount of data, do better than human. And you can enumerate probably easily 20 or 30 professions that will be challenged and partially or fully displaced. So the governments have a hard time making this a priority because unemployment numbers are not yet high. But once it starts to go up, it might go up very fast and be harder to control.
There's probably a corporate responsibility as well here, but given the pressure on companies to deliver bottom line, especially listed companies,
yeah.
Do you get a sense that that businesses are aware of the social changes caused by AI and are gearing up?
Well, I think the AI companies are definitely aware, but they don't want to talk about it because it's a PR problem, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's why I wrote the book that I wrote, so that more people can be aware this is an issue that will come up. This is not a statement that unemployment will go dramatically high. It just says there's going to be a dislocation of skills. Because if AI can do at some point in next 15 years all routine tasks, then people who have routine tasks will be displaced without any way to get employed again unless they took on retraining and went into a non-routine task.
But it's not just blue-collar workers. There are also some professions which will be affected by AI.
Blue-collar workers are actually a little bit difficult to displace because our hand-eye coordination are really amazing, and robotics are not yet at that level. On the other hand, white-collar jobs, such as customer service, telemarketing, telesales, loan officers, it's just algorithms, just software, just data that will displace these jobs. Citi has already announced they will let go 10,000 of their 20,000 back office operational workers and replacing them with automation.
You said at the opening that one could argue the US isn't actually in lead of AI. Depends on the measure, I guess.
Right.
But China is almost certain to take the lead in the foreseeable future. Is that the case?
Well, let's say they will co-lead. I think I wouldn't underestimate Silicon Valley innovations. So let's say, I think my last picture in 5 years out shows US and China co-leading the implementation with an added kicker that should a breakthrough come by in the US might retake the lead. So let's just say US and China will co-lead. That, I think, is certainty. It's like in the Olympic competition, there are only 3 medals. In the AI competition, there are only 2 medals. Who is gold and who is silver is not known, but there is no bronze medal.
Yeah. What about other countries outside those superpowers? When they co-lead AI, and AI brings about such fundamental change to politics, to business, to economics, there's a chance that countries will be left behind.
Yes, in particular, developing countries.
Yeah.
Because previously, they could look forward to the China model or the India model of outsourcing blue-collar work or white-collar work. But if those are, number one, outsourceable to another country, number 2, routine in nature, then they're by definition doable by AI. So the China model and the India model towards development is now no longer a viable option. That's a particular issue for them. And then I think in the developed countries, I do think some countries still have a shot if they get their national policies in order. UK, Canada, Singapore, Israel, France are some examples where we think the book ought to be a sound an alarm to have them to say, wait a minute, I'm going to create a bronze medal even though there isn't one now.
The breakthrough, you said that there may be a breakthrough. What would that breakthrough look like? What for non-technologists like myself, what's in the frame? What are the researchers looking for?
Sure. For example, making autonomous vehicle L5 suddenly work. And that will probably not be open source technology. So whoever makes that work first and do so in a non-open source manner, I don't see why that has to be open source. That would be one huge breakthrough. I think figuring out how to train AI with less data, that would be another big breakthrough. That's not only very useful, but it would neutralize China's advantage. Yeah. Those are two examples.
Well, just finally, where are you looking? Because you've invested clearly in some what are now very successful companies. Are you looking in China and at particular sectors or particular types of app? Where are you looking?
I think the biggest opportunity that's yet not fully harvested is financial. Because financial markets, financial applications, banks, insurance, trading, are basically human fabricated games of numbers. And there's no friction of operation, manufacturing, logistics. That complicates the whole thing. And when AI is applied to these domains, basically you build something that prints cash and you've got a knob. So that's hardly been fully done. Of course, there are obstacles such as regulations and incumbents and things like that. That's the easiest. The most aspirational is healthcare. And that's one we're starting to look at. But frankly, that's very hard because we need high quality and large quantities of data. China has high quantities, but the quality is not good enough. US has high quality, but the hospitals don't understand the importance of quantity. So they focus on the 10,000 records they have and the leadership they can maintain as opposed to some kind of pooling. So that's a very, very big one that I think we all want to see, but it's a little bit difficult now.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Your final answer leads very nicely into our next panel where we're going to be looking specifically at tech and financial services. But congratulations on the book. Thank you for speaking despite your laryngitis. Thank you for powering through. Please join me in thanking Dr. Kai-Fu Lee. So good. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Kai-Fu Lee, who tonight will receive the Asia House Asian Business Leaders Award for 2018 at a dinner just across the road. Please join me again in thanking Dr. Kai-Fu Lee. We've been speaking all morning about geopolitics driving world trade, and as you just heard, technology is a huge part of this. Artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, they're here, they're making dramatic changes to the way we live, the way we work. The rise of blockchain and its ability to enable frictionless transactions, that has the potential to revolutionize global trade. Blockchain is just part of a wider technology picture in the fintech space. It's moving at a rapid pace and it's reshaping industries. So in this session, we're going to look at some real-world examples of technology driving change in business and in trade and financial services through the creation of new digital ecosystems. And one key challenge of that, as Kai-Fu mentioned, is regulation. How do regulators keep pace with technical innovation? And in its attempts to do so, how do regulators not become impediments to innovation and to change? So, to introduce my panelists, Sopnendu Mohanty, who's Chief FinTech Officer, Monetary Authority of Singapore, Marcus Treacher, Senior Vice President, Customer Success at Ripple, Syed Shahid Hussain, Managing Partner, Financial Services Sector for ASEAN at IBM, and Kiran Kumar, who's Assistant Managing Director, Singapore Economic Development Board. Thank you for joining us. Sopnendu, I want to start with you, following on from the conversation with Kai-Fu. MAS put out guidance notes on AI, I believe, last week. Yes. Is that MAS recognizing that the changes are happening quickly? Is it positioning MAS and Singapore as a sort of thought leader in regulating this extraordinary new world of technology?
I think, well, thanks for having me. I had a large conference and I lost my voice.
There's a lot of that going around.
Yes, I think we got 40,000 people here. They're spreading the virus. So, yes, so I think one of the reason why we thought we put a public consultation on the whole thing was that we started understanding the negative implication of privacy, transparency, accountability when it comes to data. And as I was listening to Kai-Fu, almost a year back, every Chinese company I met, they told me they're using AI for P2P, all this P2P lending. And today you look at, is a disaster in China. Almost a $200 billion industry collapsing like anything. So there is a risk of not managing this technology and what we understand, the privacy, the implication of accountability of data, which leads to the massive disaster what China just saw, in spite of AI being the core technologies drove that industry for last three to 4 years. So we are worried about that, and that's the reason we put it out there. And also, we got to acknowledge that there's another challenge happening as we see the whole policy across the globe around data localization. Almost there's a reverse thinking happening. Countries are getting nationalistic about data. They're telling my data, my country, stay in my country. If that starts happening, all the AI trying to take advantage of data will start struggling. In fact, I like where Kai-Fu put it out. The next breakthrough is small data.
Yes.
And how to rely on small data to make the next best thing available to the market. So that's the other thing to worry about.
Kai-Fu also said, Marcus, that financial services is where he is looking for investment, because that's where a lot of the change opportunity can come. Ripple's an active player in there. Give us a sense of where Ripple's come and what the market's like using blockchain for the transactions.
Yeah, certainly. So Ripple is a very interesting example of how you need to engage with today's world if you are going to change it. So we came out of the laboratory about 2 years ago, and we've been working with real banks, real payment companies worldwide, regulators, government bodies, and we've implemented real-world, active, value-add blockchain technology. We process payments today, tomorrow, around the world in microseconds, like the internet works. But we've achieved that by combining the innovation side, the Silicon Valley creativity, with hard graft. And I mean, to your point, it's only when you engage with today's world and you start to replumb and look at some of these really, unsexy, colorful, difficult problems that are embedded in the financial system around messaging, formats, local clearing. You fix those problems, you're working with governments and regulators to kind of redefine how things should be governed. That's where the value of new technology really can be applied. It's a combination of creativity and good old-fashioned hard graft and engineering to bring that creativity to market.
Shahid, I'm keen to talk to you about some of the real-world examples, as Marcus said, of where technology is being used in trade and in business. Let's start with blockchain first, because I know there are various others we can talk about. Sure. But IBM's been working with Maersk and others about using blockchain. So tell us more about the successes and challenges of that.
Yes, so we have been working with the large client across the globe to apply not just blockchain, but IoT and API particularly, which is an unsung hero, I would say, and cognitive to develop new business models, right? And we have seen a lot of success. If I have to give some examples, for example, you spoke about Maersk, TradeLens, right? The impact is huge because if you look at almost $16 trillion US trade flows through shipping agencies, right? And if we put that trade on a very efficient and transparent platform, our assessment is because of the cycle time reduction, because of the efficiency, we can unlock a value of almost $1.5 to $1.8 trillion. Right? That's a potential we see. And with the current capacity that we have, we can serve additional 15% of the requirement. Just think of it that 80% of the things that we consume here in Singapore, 80% comes through one of the shipping companies. And 5% here and there will have a huge impact on the lifestyle in Singapore. So that's the impact. right? Similarly, if you look at other areas, but there are a lot of challenges in, as you ask about, what are the challenges in implementing these technologies, particularly the blockchain you spoke about. Okay, if you talk about maybe machine learning and API, they don't have so much impact on the basic business model, operating model. But blockchain in particular has a very huge impact on the business model, operating model, and value chain of the organization, right? Because the business model span across regulation because we are seeing industries merging. These business models span across countries, right? So how do you manage laws across countries? How you manage regulations across industries, right? Those are the big challenges that we are seeing. In fact, we were talking about a good blockchain use case for a utility, a banking utility in one of the countries in the region, and we formed a consortium and went to the regulator, and the regulator said that I want to own this platform, and there's a lack of clarity whether the regulator should be providing guidance or he should be owning the platform. Those gaps exist in making these technologies successful. So that's one challenge we are facing. And I think thanks to the team, Singapore government is much progressive, but other countries in the ASEAN are not keen. And one of the regulators is sitting with our proposal to create a blockchain platform of a shared KYC. That's the challenge we are facing. The other challenge we are facing why some of these technologies are not so successful as we were seeing 2 or 3 years ago was because there's lack of clarity on the governance, lack of clarity on the ownership, lack of clarity on the operating model, right? And when you talk about the IPs and confidentiality, because a lot of these technologies are available on cloud. If you look at IBM Hyperledger is available on cloud, IoT platforms are available on cloud, right? Cognitive technologies are available on cloud. But a lot of countries in the region don't allow you to put PII on cloud. So those are the other challenges we are facing in putting some of these technologies into a good innovative business model.
So a lot of it is around governance, regulation, and standardization.
Exactly.
Okay. Kieran, where are you looking for innovation now? Because it's part of your role. You know, blockchain is working, it's active, but what else is on your agenda?
So I think that's a great question, and I think you have a panel of experts in the finance and technology field. But more broadly speaking, I think we see the digital economy taking off in a very big way across Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Some stats, a 240 billion market in the next 5-6 years, 1.7 million new jobs, 600 million population, 350 million users of technology. Beyond finance, which is a huge growth theater that you've heard about, we see pockets of opportunities in some other areas. We speak a lot about data and flows and how AI can enable that, but we are talking a lot about consumer data and banking data. But if you unpack data, you see machine level data, business level data, and over there, the balkanization questions and rhetoric is a lot less. And I think over here, Singapore is well positioned to be a center node where global multinationals in manufacturing, in logistics, in FMCG, including banking, can actually play within a digital ecosystem that Singapore, enabled by technology partners, both fast-growing technology startups, unicorns, and also other technology suppliers like IBM, to really co-create new business models, new products, new services. But the clincher here is this, and we alluded to that. In the future, in the digital economy, the biggest challenge is how do the public and private sector come together to co-innovate? It's around the nexus of technology, business models, policy, and regulation coming together. And I think Singapore can play a role. The government can play a role to lean in beyond the basics that we've been doing to grow the ecosystem in terms of capabilities, infrastructure, and policy. I think the future is how can Singapore government be a partner with various sectors to actually innovate some of the spaces.
How can regulators be a partner in this? Because it is moving very quickly.
Absolutely. I think Said's talked about the whole blockchain. We run the largest public-private partnership on blockchain program in Singapore. The reason we did it because for a technology like blockchain has to be pervasive, it has to be part of the public infrastructure. So sometimes the government has to take a big step in driving such initiative in a big public-private partnership program. And let me come back to Said's point around, I think we need to be logical in where we move the technology. 3 years back, when we started looking at technology as part of our strategic policy in Singapore, the first thing we looked at the API policy. Why that is critical before coming to blockchain and cloud? Because that significantly changes the architecture of the industry. because the old-fashioned industry was enterprise architect. One single box, everything is built around that. Of course, IBM and Microsoft made a lot of money out of it. But keeping that aside, now it is distributed.
Yeah.
Now the APIs is forcing small companies to build great solution for a small value proposition. It's changing the business model dramatically. The second policy stance we took was around cloud, because nobody's writing software for cloud for a physical data center. They're all written on a cloud-based architecture. So that's the second policy which Singapore government, MAS, came and put together. Ravi Menon's famous speech, MAS has no objection to cloud. The third aspect is the blockchain, the distributed part of the data creation, because that almost answers the questions around the data residency issues we are struggling with now. If we can create a distributed platform where the data created at the respective jurisdiction can be kept there without necessarily being moved out to a centralized hub, I think that solves the data problem. And that's where we have come across and put a program, multiple banks, multiple partners working together to solve a few use cases. And the last space is the whole question around data.
Yes.
It's not necessary now with the latest technology to move the data. I can actually run algorithm without necessarily moving data at the site in a way the physical data doesn't have to be moved. But to have that construct in place, you got to get that A, API, B, blockchain, C, cloud, D, data, all in line. And that's where we come as a partner to the industry through some programs as Project Ubin. Recently, Prime Minister Modi launched in Singapore the largest public partnership on the APIs built by a different fintech to be plugged to banking system. Similar programs will drive adoption of technology while regulators are understanding the risk associated with such technology.
Marcus, working with regulators must be a key part of your development.
It is, yes. So we're creating an internet of value. That's our mission for payments and transacting worldwide. To make that happen, you have to have governance as well. So although the core magic dust in Ripple is blockchain technology, crypto technology, the real enabler has been creating a governance body, which we call the RippleNet Committee. And that is a member of leading banks, which are voted onto a governing body with a formal membership structure. It's a scheme, and it's the first one to be created internationally since SWIFT was created back in 1974. And that's really enabled us to engage with regulators, given us the kind of like gravitas within the industry so that we are not just a technology innovation company, we're also a credible, highly credible, effective community for cross-border payments in a whole new model. But you have to create that governance body, you have to create that engagement within which you can connect into the regulatory world. And that involves working with the banks and the lead organizations worldwide to form that structure. And that's how we've really got traction globally.
Just quick, I think all of us have heard about the sandbox framework. Yes. I think a lot of central bank regulators are putting together a sandbox framework which allows companies like Ripple to come to us, bring a business model, and we are going to provide that regulatory support as we understand the technology better. So that kind of fast tracks the whole process. The old-fashioned white paper, make policy, technology always ahead of you will now get reduced because of the sandbox framework.
So there will be a lag of sorts.
Absolutely. So you experiment with the industry, with technology, business model as they're getting built.
Yeah. So when we were speaking last night, we talked about certain things, digital ecosystems, but also new players versus incumbents and what incumbents are now doing. And you said something which I found fascinating, that some of the incumbent players are actually now doing more.
Exactly.
And having more success.
Exactly. So every year in IBM, we have a IBM Institute of Business Value, and we talk to CXOs and board members across the globe. And this year, we spoke to almost 12,000 CXOs. And in the last 4 or 5 years, all the CXOs said that fintechs were really going to disrupt the banking industry, and banks were supposed to stand up and listen. But this year, almost 72% of the CEOs and board members out of 12,000 said that it's fintech who are at number 4 in creating disruption, particularly in the financial services sector. And the real disruption in the last 2 years had come from the incumbents. That's existing players in the industry, which was quite surprising for us. And then we started looking at the data. And then we realized that, to our surprise, that the investment from the PE and other organization in fintech is lowest in the last couple of years, in the last 40 years. That was one very interesting finding. And then we also start realizing why are incumbents doing much better than the fintechs in the last couple of years. And there were two reasons which really stand out. One reason was that it's a matter of survival. If you don't invest, you'll be not there. And the second important data which our earlier presenter spoke about was that data. Okay, 80% of the data still resides behind the firewall of the organizations. Right, only 20% of the data is with Twitters of the world or Facebook of the world. And incumbents, existing organizations have that advantage. And that's why you'll see that I was discussing with Marcus is that very small number of fintechs have been able to scale up, but very large number of incumbents have been able to come out with very strong operating model, business models. If you look at, let's say, WeTrade or TradeLens, or you look at, let's say, other large fintechs which are being formed by large organizations, by investment, or Everledger, or in India, if you look at India, I have been spending a lot of time there. One of the largest bank has created a very strong fintech, I would say, called Yono, which is not just a digital bank, but it's a financial superstore and it's an e-commerce platform. And they are acquiring almost 24,000 customers per day. Okay, so what we are seeing is correct, is that we are seeing incumbents coming back and striking back at the fintech and driving innovation, and we feel that it's a time for collaboration rather than competition between the incumbents and the fintech to drive innovation. So that's where we are seeing the collaboration between the incumbents and the fintech heading in future.
It depends how you define fintech.
Yeah.
I think
that is a very good point.
Is because the fintech's side is talking about is a B2C fintech, same customer base they're trying to attract. 80% of the fintech world is B2B. And a lot of PE firm VC firms don't understand those fintech well because they go by B2C models. They look for number of customers, number of transactions. Ripple is a B2B fintech. They sit behind, they transform the systems from middle office, back office. Very hard for a PE and VC to make a sense of what is going on here. There's a long tail structure there. I think the disruption of fintech is not on the banks. The disruption of fintech is on the large tech company who have done a very poor job in solving the financial sector challenges. Look at this math. If you look at the revenue stream of large tech company, you pick any tech company, 40 to 50% of revenue comes from financial sector. Who has the worst technology? Banks.
Yeah.
How is possible the industry which pays the largest bill has the worst technology? So something is wrong in that construct. So that's the problem fintech are trying to solve now. They're trying to solve the B2B infrastructure, back office, middle office, the processes behind getting simplified, the whole issue around cross-border payment. No tech company has solved it. I think finally we are getting some fintech to look at it seriously and solving that problem.
You've been nodding furiously there.
Sorry,
Mark.
We've solved it, which is good.
There you go.
That's a very, very good point. I think we're a very good test case, I guess, to look at which kind of companies win and which companies struggle in this new world. And it's not about fintech or large bank, as you say. It's really about mindset and energy. So we work with hundreds of banks and payment companies around the world. The guys that are moving quickest are the companies with real top-down engagement, senior drive, so they can apply their clout, their financial ability to do things generally differently. So working, for example, with Siam Commercial Bank, CIMB Malaysia signed on very recently, and Standard Chartered here in Singapore. And these ASEAN-based institutions work with us from the very top of the organization. So applying their clout, their capability, but in doing so, they're embracing innovation, change, dynamism. A lot of firms can't do that. A lot of firms find it very difficult to kind of galvanize and pull things together against one target. Yeah. So I think it's more about the kind of commercial animal you are versus your size that defines whether you're going to win in the 21st century or whether you're going to become history.
This is also a regional thing because ASEAN in particular seems to be a huge amount of money, the great potential, as you spoke of earlier, of the digital economy and ASEAN. None of the legacy systems in some cases, none of the legacy companies in some cases. So is it about region as well as about mindset?
Yes.
So I think I agree with the discussion so far where incumbents are going to be the next wave where a lot of this innovation at scale will be implemented in different industries. A little known fact, if you look at any Fortune 500 company today and you ask them, where is your mandate for digital innovation? Most of them will say Silicon Valley, we have a little outpost. But the second largest concentration of Fortune 500 digital centers of excellence is in Singapore. And it's for a different reason. Asia is a large, fast-growing market. It's a fragmented market. They have decision-making mandates in Singapore because of the headquarters, but we also have a large and vibrant ecosystem that we can work with to implement at scale in a region and then scale it in the reverse innovation back to their global markets. So companies like Standard Chartered, DBS, you look at Visa, you look at Merck in pharmaceuticals, many of them have these centers over here where they put their mandates, capabilities, and budgets funded and supported by the senior management. And having a mindset of a fast-growing market, you need to innovate. Yeah. So I think these are some of the exciting things that we're seeing. Even companies like Google, which you would argue that are probably frontier in the technology space, has started a research and development center in Singapore, and they are focusing on the next billion user. They are also looking for growth. They know they need to innovate in the market for the market. So it's a very exciting time for us where you have a very diverse ecosystem in one location.
Shahid, you talk about business models and the like. Is the region part of the equation?
Yes, certainly region is a part of equation, as you correctly said, is that the challenges are different in different parts, right? Singapore being more mature, and here the business model, the emerging models are more mature and advanced, and other countries in the region are trying to grapple with what model will work for them. So what you're saying is correct.
But there's a bit of a dispute, I guess, over defining financial services.
Yes, I don't think it's a dispute, but what we are seeing, I think, is the same thing, is that what Marcus also said is that it's more of a collaboration and partnership. What banking community did was that I think they took customer for granted, and they left a lot of gap in their value proposition to the customer, right? They were not very proactive. And that's where fintech identified a big opportunity and came and very aggressively started bridging the gaps, right? And then when the banking industry got up, they started focusing more on the front end, less on the back end. As he correctly said, a lot of innovation is happening on B2B as well. So yes, fintechs are doing well. It's not that they are not, but what I was trying to say is that incumbents have come and struck back, and they are driving innovation a lot because of the deep pockets they have and the data they have. And we feel that it's more of a collaboration partnership in the interest of the customer rather than competing with each other and trying to disrupt each other. That's how we see the industry emerging. As you said, he's partnering with the SCB, which is our customer, CIMB, so it's more of a partnership to bridge the gap.
But you're doing a lot of deals out here.
Loads. We're seeing, we work globally. We're seeing the most energy and drive in Southeast Asia, Middle East, South Asia. That's where the whole market is moving so quickly. There's almost a singularity of growth, energy, dynamism, investment, can-do mentality around the Asia region. And we're seeing most of our groundbreaking innovation happening here. And it's actually working with some of these really fast-moving organizations which are future-looking and looking to change things for the better.
Right. Let's open it up now to the audience. We're very interested in your questions and your comments and your observations about this issue. Please just put your hand in the air and we'll bring a microphone around. First question, please, right over there.
Thank you. This is Hung Patterson from Royal Bank of Canada. I think we've talked a little bit about the social impact in terms of the job displacement. I did have a question, particularly for EDC and for MAS, in terms of the social responsibilities and your thoughts around the social responsibilities and the regulatory potential in terms of thinking about and the programming. So we talked about the correlation and looking at facts and correlation around facts. I think facts are easy to acknowledge. Correlation of the facts can have biases. So if you could give us your thoughts around the biases and how you manage that, given that a lot of the programmers, coders, are predominantly homogenous.
That's a great question, very complex question to answer here. I think it's a very, I think part of our design, if you look at our sandbox program, there are 3 principles which we apply for anybody trying to experiment on a new model. Is first, it has to be embedded in a new technology, and second, it should have a value system. It should be something beneficial to the society, or else we'll not do that as part of the program. And third, there should be a strong sense of neutrality in some of these biases we are talking here, because you're absolutely right. We can end up in a massive skew. It's a China example of P2P. Why it became a disaster? It because people because there is a perception that AI is making the right choice, and what happened after a year, the AI had no clue whom they're making decisions on whose behalf, whom to give the lending choices. So you're right, we should be very careful. That's the reason why MAS came up with this new policy paper around FEAT, fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency when using data and machine learning.
Yeah. Build this into your business models when you're working with clients?
Yes, we certainly take care of that, yeah.
Yeah. In what way? Do you find businesses are keen to do so, or that this is an essential part of the ultimate success of a business model?
See, when we build new business model, we look from all perspective, right? We look from the governance perspective, because as Marcus said, if the governance is not right, those business model will not successful, right? Then we also look from a regulation perspective. We look from, let's say, ownership perspective, revenue model perspective, and also how is it going to impact the organization, how people need to be retrained and redeployed in a meaningful way, right? So from all aspects, we see when we try to bring about transformative changes or build new business model for the organization.
Okay. Next question, please.
Thanks, Michael. Stephen Marcelino from Accenture Strategy. Great panel talking fintech and also incumbent. But within the financial services, what we're seeing, the big major tech firms such as BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, starting to enter financial services. Many firms also expected the American GAFA are also likely to do so. What would be the take from the panel on the likely disruption impacts and how this may shift the digital kind of economy, the digital ecosystems created in different markets? Do you anticipate some of these major tech firms enter different markets sooner than later? Be good. Thank you.
Let's start with you.
Yeah. So I think the point you have raised is very, very valid, and banks have recognized that. Right, we were with the Central Bank of Malaysia last week, and they were really, I think, one of the fintech boss had come and met the Prime Minister, and he wanted to get into the Malaysian market big time, and the regulator was quite concerned, right? So we see digital giants entering the financial services space, okay, in one way or the other, and governments may not be able to stop them in a big way. So financial services organizations have recognized that, and financial services organizations are going to face 2 challenges when these organizations are allowed to enter the market. One thing is that most of us are hooked on these platforms, right? How much time we spend on Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon, right? And one of the challenges that financial market will face is that how to get their target customer off this platform and get on their platform to ask for a loan. That will be one of the biggest challenge which financial services organization will face, and they are recognizing that. The other big challenge that financial services organization will face from these digital giants will be the ROE and the cost to income ratio at which they operate. Even if you look at banks in Singapore, they're operating at a cost to income ratio of 40, 45, 50. If you go to maybe Vietnam, they are operating at a better cost to income ratio of 27 to 35. Again, in Malaysia, Indonesia, the cost to income ratio are between 40 to 45. And if you look at these digital giants, they're operating at a cost-to-income ratio of 20, 25, 30, and they are giving a ROE to their shareholders, which is almost 20, 25%, whereas the average ROE of traditional bank is around 9 to 12%. So these are the 2 biggest challenges that banks are going to face, and banks have started building a defensive business model as we speak. right? Just to give you an example, I was talking about SBI in India, right? So what we have done with them is we have worked with them to build a digital bank, plus a financial superstore, plus an e-commerce platform where we are orchestrating almost 75 e-commerce companies. So what SBI wants is with 300 million customer base, they want people to get up in the morning and not to log on to, let's say, a Facebook or Amazon, but they want to log on to their platform. And they are offering Amazon product on their platform. Okay, they are driving almost 0.1 million traffic from their platform to Amazon and giving them better offers. We are working with a client in Indonesia, one of the large non-banking financial services, and they know that they can also be disrupted by one of the fintech. If let's say Grab is offering loan, tomorrow they can get into offering automobile loan as well. So they're also trying to create an ecosystem and a platform, and they're trying to build, let's say, ecosystem and a platform around, let's say, home ecosystem, health ecosystem, education ecosystem, and create a partnership so that they can go beyond a point solution offering, but meet the end-to-end need of a customer, whether it's life event related or lifestyle related. So financial services organizations are recognizing that. They have woken up and they are building a defensive business model, operating model, which will compete with the likes of, let's say, Alipay in terms of the customer experience and customer engagement, in terms of cost-to-income ratio, as well as in terms of return of equity that they will give to the shareholders.
Kieran. I think payments is one big area, but I think payments at the end of the day is a means to an end. What we are seeing is two big trends. One is the digital giants of the US, your Facebooks, Googles, Amazon, and the Chinese, mainly Alibaba and Tencent, descending into ASEAN in a very big way.
Big way, yeah.
There are two subtle differences, I mean, not generic, but just subtly. The Americans are coming in organically trying to grow their business. The Chinese are coming in by acquiring and partnering with different companies. So I think that's one big trend. I think everybody sees that. So these are stylistic differences in how they come into the market. The second part is that I think there's another point here. We're talking about financial services and how they will respond. But if payment is a means to an end, who is the one delivering the value in the end? So actually there's super apps forming within Southeast Asia, the likes of Tokopedia for e-commerce, Lazada, Grab, Gojek. These are becoming very powerful platforms that owns the consumer for every service, and payment is but a transaction platform. The banking system never had that sort of a structure. So I think one of the structural shifts that we're seeing is that. And then the question is, how does that actually change the game in Southeast Asia?
It's on here.
The Alibaba model outside China will not work in this market because this market at least expects interoperability. So there will be not a single dominant player running this market unless they acquire a lot of customers organically within the country. What will happen is the technology arm of those companies will go and provide the services to these banks in those markets to make their own productivity, efficiency grow better. The second challenge will be around what I think is the biggest challenge around is the payment. What seems to be an opportunity will not be an opportunity in the long run. What you see in Singapore, where today in Singapore, if I have to send money from A account to B account, it is 3 clicks, 0 cost. You can't make money out of that anymore. So a lot of this emerging market in ASEAN countries will build payment infrastructure which will be cheaper and be faster. I think there's no money to be made in those space. What you will see as a model, as you see Ping An launching One Connect. They're a technology company, pure technology company trying to provide alternate technology services to those banks. That's the partnership we'll see, but I don't see a direct business model going to the market competing against the local financial services till they come with the new interoperable models.
Marcus.
Yeah, I think the winners will be regulated. So I think the regulatory world around financial services will still very much be there in future. I do think, though, that we are going through a tipping point, and we are seeing a lot of very successful organizations win in the market by doing one thing really well: payment companies, analytical companies, investment companies. So we can see the kind of defragmentation of the universal banking model really kicking in. We can also see defragmentation of these global behemoths that cover many, many markets. And we can see, certainly with data concerns and data protection, the future will be a world where many, many specialized service providers, whether they're banks, payment companies, shipping companies, manufacturers, robotics, will interconnect together in a web of commerce. That's really where we think it's heading. Volumes will be massive, billions and billions. There should be 50 billion or so, give or take a few, unattended devices plugged into the internet by 2020. They will start acting. You'll have KYT, know your thing, versus KYC, your customer. Yeah. And in that world, and I can link to that idea of the digital banks that have cost-income ratios which are off the Richter scale, as you said. These players, if we roll forward 15, 20 years, will be regulated. They'll be part of communities that meet like we're doing today. But the models, the dynamics will be very, very different. There are no shipping companies that today own airlines. The shipping companies never made that transition to flying rather than sailing around the world. It's very difficult for existing successful companies to make those shifts and to recognize when the tipping point is here. So many of the large players in the financial services world today, I'd argue, would struggle to compete in the 5 to 10 years in the future. And the top 10 of 2020 are probably not on the circuit today.
Just to repeat, the stronger data regulation will actually change the business model. It will be very tough for Alibaba model will work in this market.
Okay. Look, I'm afraid we have to leave it there because we're out of time. Fascinating discussion. There's so much happening in this space. We'll continue to follow it at Asia. There's so much happening in this region, in this space in particular. So please join me in thanking our speakers, Marcus Treacher, Swapnindra Mohanty, Shahid Hussain, and Kiran Kumar. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We stay with technology now. As I said, thank you very much. We'll stay with tech now, and very pleased to welcome to the stage Maya Hari, Vice President, Asia Pacific at Twitter. Now, if you go to Twitter and you press the About button, because I did that, this is what you get. Twitter is what's happening in the world and what people are talking about right now. I spent most of my career in the media. People would talk about a media storm. They now talk about a social media storm, which is normally a debate on Twitter, whether it's the US president announcing policy changes, whether it's a showbiz story, whether it's sport. It seems to all happen on Twitter, and it is a source of news, source of information. But what are the broader trends in Asia, not just for consumers, but also for businesses, new businesses and existing businesses? We'd like to hear about that. So please welcome to the stage Maya Hari.
Thank you. You made my job easier by talking about our mission and what's happening on Twitter. Thank you for having me here at the event. I'd love to talk a little bit about sort of the rise of digital society in Asia and the trends that are associated with it. There's no better time to be in Asia than now, it feels like. That's the emotion I carry when I compare my sentiment with my peers who run other regions. For Twitter, it feels like the canvas is very rich for innovation, for a lot of activity happening here. You know, we're as a region, we're expected to grow 5.5% this year, accounting for nearly 2/3 of the global growth, according to IMF, which is exciting. And the region remains the world's most dynamic by a considerable margin. What is also exciting is Asia really leading the digital revolution. Right, both as a consumer market as well as technology being built out of here. Last year, we had nearly 1.9 billion internet users in Asia, and that continues to grow at about 8% year on year. And you know, a large part of that region, 70% of users are expected to be really mobile, and this becomes a very on mobile and becomes a very big differentiator in a lot of what drives Asia versus the rest of the world. But within that, some of the interesting things, half of the millennials in the world will be in Asia by 2020. Half of the internet users, half of the social media users. And so clearly, if you need a cheat sheet on some demographic number around digital you need to plug in, half is in Asia, would be roughly safe to say, right? But I think the one biggest trend there is the millennial usage or the millennial consumers. That demographic, in our view, actually drives a lot of separation of what happens in Asia versus the rest of the world. So the millennials in Asia are tech savvy, they're tech obsessed, they love science. And it's interesting, their consumption of everything digital and their lifestyle patterns actually are a driving force in catapulting a bunch of digital industries, right? We see this in commerce, just being able to discover and buy on mobile. The propensity to do that weekly by this millennial audience starts to show what happens in the commerce world. Same with payments, same with food delivery in this part of the world, and travel. The obsession to travel by these consumers is going to fundamentally change the number of jobs in travel we will see. 1 in 10 jobs in travel, 1 in 10 jobs in the region will be in the travel industry. To a large part because of this segment. One of the things that we see is based on the conversations we see millennials or audiences in general having on Twitter, it tends to define what they're interested in, what they're thinking about. And so we learn a lot from this. And the millennial consumer is deeply driven by purpose, by equality, and by concerns for things like environment, right? And this starts to pose some interesting trends for us to understand how business will evolve, right? So it's not uncommon for us to sort of see countries like India and China and millennials in this region care more about the environment because they're sort of living in a scenario where carbon footprint is really challenging, and caring for climate change and talking about action that they would like to contribute to is something that we see very often. This year has been an interesting year for equality. Both from gender equality and really fighting women coming out, sharing their voices on trying to have an equal footing has been remarkable to see around the region, but also things like same-sex marriage and marriage equality becoming a big trend around Australia and Taiwan and India, and sort of that discussion and debate playing out on the platform we saw. But the other really interesting trend with the rise of millennials in this segment is also that they are pushing businesses to do the right thing. And they will vote with their dollars on who to buy. And they don't just buy a product or a service anymore. They buy what you stand for as a company. And that's an interesting change for industry to think about as these digital consumers who are heavily connected and talking publicly. How do you have a play and a say in that mindset of the consumer? But if you sort of step out of just that millennial segment and look wider, we also saw other trends play out. Asia accounted for more than half of the worldwide digital video viewing audience last year. So video as a format has essentially become the common currency now of communication. We sort of expect that it will surpass 1.3 billion viewers by 2020. So the numbers continue to grow there. Now within Twitter, we see, that's the industry at large. Within Twitter, we see similar trends as well. Asia sort of continues to lead growth for the company globally and is rising in importance. And video consumption on Twitter as well mirrors that trend. Now, if you think beyond the native digital economy, you also have a large consideration of digital transformation of the traditional businesses. And we actually see that this will add about $1.6 trillion US dollars to Asia's GDP. And so that's a big consideration as well. We heard from the panel earlier talking a little bit about the banks and how they have to transform. But if you sort of take that wider lens, there's several industries there. And you know, a study from Microsoft and IDC actually expects that an incremental 1% of growth to Asia's GDP would come from this transformation, right? And so at that point, 60% of Asia's GDP will be derived from digital products and services. So this innate trend of consumers getting comfortable with technology sort of will have that ripple effect widely beyond the native digital economy. Now, this is all great. It's a strong outlook for Asia, and we love that, and it's a rich canvas. But there are some headwinds that our industry thinks about a lot, including, you know, some domestic market corrections. While China has had a fantastic growth, and it's been incredible to see, will we see some corrections there as we go? A shift towards the more protectionist policies. It's something that the digital economy, you know, thinks about a lot, and particularly, and I think Kiran sort of referred to this a little bit, fragmentation of the internet and the data ideologies of the world. The incredibly fast spread of the internet has traditionally happened because there's been one internet and you could scale things globally and across regions in a very fast way if you had the right product or service. And that is sort of getting heavily challenged now if the data ideologies play out differently. So that's something that we will as an industry sort of keep an eye on. The other interesting you know, prospect for 2019 is election season is upon us in Asia. So we will have 5 countries in the region, you know, Australia, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, all heading into elections. We will expect to see, you know, greater digital diplomacy from governments, from constituents, from political parties. But also, there's an interesting trend around in Asia where there's a better digital bridge being built between consumers and governments for a really, you know, good outcome. Flattening of bureaucratic processes has been great to see, and also better efficiency in adding value on a day-to-day basis to a consumer's life. So we do expect to continue to see that. We've seen some of that play out for very positive results in both India and Indonesia, and as well as mature markets like Singapore and Australia. So we expect that will continue, and especially the elections tend to be, you know, catalysts for more change in that space. As the Asian economy is becoming increasingly digitized, we see clear strengths emerging from the region. Artificial intelligence, Kai-Fu talked about that extensively. Mobile-first offerings, payments, which we heard a lot about, and commerce, particularly speed, agility, and engineering talent being strengths of the region. We continue to sort of see that you know, play out to other areas, especially as we start to explore more deep tech beyond AI in this part of the world. And it's great to see sort of our homegrown entrepreneurial talents really emerge on the global stage in that sense. Now, this year, if you follow one sort of internet report globally, it tends to be Mary Meeker's report. I don't know if many of you see this. In our industry, we live by Mary Meeker's report. And for the first time, 9 out of 20 of the most valuable technology companies actually were Asian, all Chinese, but it has transformed significantly from a year or two ago. So we're nearly half and half in terms of the most valuable companies being American versus Asian. And it's interesting, we continue to see those trends grow. If you track the number of unicorns that come out of Asia, that and you know, valuations are always subjective, so it's not an absolute metric, but you start to see the hotbed of Southeast Asia, India, and China really drive you know, incredibly valuable homegrown companies coming out of here. We saw 3 industries in the last few years really come to a head: e-commerce, payments, and sharing economy. One of the things as we look forward is an interesting area that hasn't been solved yet is local language and localization. Because of the fragmentation of Asia, when Western companies have traditionally built all of the large services, they have not necessarily had to think first about the complexity of language. But now it's different, and especially if you are not just a Chinese company building for China, but an Asian company building for Asia, because you have some natural cultural strengths here, the language problem is not one that's easy to solve, and the ecosystem doesn't exist yet. So this is one area that we anticipate a lot of innovation to come around. You might see, if you take the DiDi app and use the DiDi app when you're in China, when you're traveling in China, you sort of can chat to your driver in your own language, and it automatically translates back and forth to Chinese. Now, imagine a world where that happens across services and across the internet, right? That could be a vision that may help solve some of the challenges that we have in the fragmentation of Asia. So that feels definitely like an area that we will see near-term innovation come out of, and definitely an opportunity that feels like it's unsolved. But above all of this, I think the opportunities also, Asia is a growing population, and how do we continue to connect more and more people to the internet? And the mobile-first opportunity is incredible. We see this with the mobile phone industry enjoying an incredible amount of growth coming out of Asia, and that's sort of helping drive connecting more populations into Asia. The final sort of area to think about is smart cities, smart nations, smart technologies also require smart conversation, especially to connect and converse with digital natives. At Twitter, we think deeply about this because our purpose is to serve the public conversation. One of our fundamental beliefs is that if by enabling public and real-time conversation, we think the world can solve problems and needs very quickly because there's no information asymmetry. And that very much applies to how we think about how the industry thinks about smart cities as well. Part of what we do is allow companies to talk to their customers and to the rest of the world, but potentially using technology to talk between government and constituents or between cities and constituents. There have been great stories. There's a little town called Hun in Spain, which is one of my favorite stories, that has essentially every constituent, every citizen living in that town, completely digitally connected to every service. And so they might report that, hey, there's a garbage can on the street. They will tweet that out. And literally within hours, the administration that's tracking everything digitally picks that up and moves the garbage can, posts a picture back, and says, hey, it's done. Have a nice day, right? It's a utopian world. Hun is a small town, less than 10,000 people, if I remember right. But it would be amazing to have certain levels of smartness as we continue to see cities become smarter and smarter. And we definitely see technologies continuing to enable that. As we go through this in Asia, it means sort of solving for multi-religions, multi-races, multilingual and multicultural communities, thinking about their sentiment, thinking about the cultural nuances adds incredible complexity to how to do this right. And this is something that I think the digital world and the digital industry has to learn quickly on how to do this, because you have to balance speed, which is native to the digital world, with doing it right. And that's a interesting trend on how the industry overall is learning to adapt. From our perspective, I think the goal to ensure that all sides of the conversation is always visible to the youth, from the youth to the business leaders, to policymakers, to personalities, is always a wonderful thing because you're able to represent open and public discussion and debate around ideas that matter. So I'll wrap up with this, and I'll invite you all as co-captains of the industry to sort of look forward to collaborating and continuing this dialogue on what it will take to have one digital Asia as such. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. Again, just phenomenal trends. The pace of change is breathtaking. Well, now for our final panel, we're moving on to the very important issue of Belt and Road. And China, as you know, has described the Belt and Road Initiative as helping to usher in a new era of globalization. The private sector globally has shown enormous interest in getting involved in the project. And there's no doubt about the desperate need for infrastructure in developing Asia. However, views on the Belt and Road have turned negative following the debt trap in which Sri Lanka found itself and the decision of the new Malaysian government to suspend $22 billion of China-backed BRI projects. The US has been openly critical of the initiative and is rallying its traditional allies to offer an alternative. US Vice President Mike Pence spoke at the APEC summit a week ago. He talked of loans where terms are often opaque at best, and projects that they support often being unsustainable and of poor quality. Too often, he said, they come with strings attached and lead to staggering debt. Very harsh words. The US, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand unveiled at APEC a $1.7 billion plan to bring electricity and the internet to much of Papua New Guinea. This is widely seen as a countermeasure to Belt and Road. So, has the gloss worn off the vision of Belt and Road? And will China adjust its approach to projects in response to this pushback? And that's the subject of my panel now. I'm joined by Donald Kainak, Chairman of Eastspring Investments, Gregory Hodkinson, Chairman of Arup, Professor Xiang Bing, Dean of the Chung Kong Graduate School of Business, and Goi Sui Noi, who's China Bureau Chief of the Straits Times. Please welcome my guests. Thank you all. Now, Belt and Road has come up in every conversation just about that we've had today. A huge but very contentious issue. I'll start with you, Don. The politics have turned sour. Is this the wheels falling off the Belt and Road Initiative?
First of all, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with the politics turning sour. I think there's definitely criticism and there's definitely some well-deserved criticism, but I would think if you travel around, leave Singapore today and get on a plane and go to other parts of ASEAN. I mean, our business, by the way, Eastspring Investments is the Asia asset management business of the Prudential. The Prudential of the UK has been in this region for 90 years, and the footprint's all over. So you go to Cambodia, you go to Laos, you go to Indonesia, and test the waters there. You wouldn't hear it's become unpopular or the wheels are falling off.
So it's a Western construct, this.
There are definitely issues and there are definitely problems, and you pointed out some very good examples of very big projects that for reasons of unsustainability, whether that's fiscal unsustainability, there are environmental questions or whatever, have stumbled, have come and run into trouble. And I think there are a lot of lessons to learn and a lot of things to take forward in terms of engaging. But I wouldn't say the wheels have fallen off. I would say, sort of in general, in a big picture sense, what I see is not a conspiracy. There are even theories out there. Well, these projects are loaded with debt, and then the long-term plan is they fail, and then there's a takeover. I guess we could conceive that's a possibility, but I think it's much more likely if one looks at the way China has, we heard earlier from a couple of the speakers about, Dr. Lee this morning, the way of competition is to move big and fast and make things happen quickly. That scale and speed, when you take it outside of China, where you don't have this constant state of reform or ability to do mid-course correction, and you bring it into other countries, its scale and speed is having some breakage. And I think that's the issue that needs to be dealt with. I think the concept of Belt and Road and the need for massive infrastructure financing and building in the region is is absolutely indisputable.
Professor, I saw you nodding furiously there. So the wheels haven't fallen off, which was my phrase, but there might need to be some adjustments. Would that be your take on it?
Well, before I make my remark, I would like to take a digression to echo some of the points made earlier by Minister Chan. And then there's so much focus on trade, but I think another issue may warrant more attention is neoliberalism, studied by Ms. Thatcher in 1979, and then followed by President Reagan, shaped the reform in China fundamental way. So China, U.S. embraced neoliberalism better than any other country on earth. Accordingly, you may consider China the most capitalist country on earth, and because we don't have any decent social security whatsoever. We don't benchmark well against that of Russia, you know. So the challenge for the U.S. is what's next after neoliberalism. The challenge for China is more complex. Not only we have neoliberalism, but we have a state capitalism, which is a key concern to many Western countries. And for Europe, it's a matter of how do you compete with two major capitalist blocs, China and the US. Put a lot of pressure on it. Come back to the trade issue. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative came in a context of change the China policy by the US. In Clinton time, is embrace China, bring China into the WTO, make China a responsible stakeholder. Obama time was different, embrace China with a hedging strategy. So TPP, TTIP, and pivot to Asia. And then, so China, I think Belt and Road Initiative could be part of the response by China. You know, not only the RCEP, not only the free trade zone in Shanghai, but also the Belt and Road Initiative, you know, and it's the difference in ideas, how do you reconfigure the global trading system. And so this is a more broader context, you know. But if you look at the need for infrastructure, it's there, whether this region, you know, if you look at the experience of China, if you don't have roads, bridges, no possibility development. When you have roads, bridges, then we talk about something else, you know. Actually, the whole idea should be hugely welcome, regard whatever you say, you know. And yes, there's going to be some self-interest from China's side, and you know, we do have huge experience in capacity experience. Because one time I remember, about 90% of global crane was concentrating in Pudong. 90% global. So our experience, our scale is unrivaled, unmatched by anyone. That experience should be shared globally. And also it's about time for Chinese companies to go global. You have IBM, GE, Siemens. Why Chinese companies should stay in China? So it's about time. They need to go global. You know, one capability we have is infrastructure, you know. And then so, well, what about this debt stuff? And if you look at, you know, the Chinese foreign aid to Africa in 2018 represent about 2% of the total debt. 2%, $6 trillion US, you know. Then you have a huge noise, pushback, criticism, all of that, you know. I grew up in China. When you criticize Chinese investment, well, why don't you pay attention to transparency, human rights record of government? When I grew up, elementary school, I remember clearly, my teacher asked me to donate 1 cent a month for vaccination African children. I'm getting close to 60 years old. I was elementary school. So our focus on Africa, way beyond today, oil, stuff like that, okay. What I want to say is this. As a child, when you grow up in that environment, you are so helpless. Regardless of human rights record of my government, you know, and I think I need to have access to roads, bridges, schools, hospitals. You know, it's very easy for you to talk about this stuff. Yeah, I want to share my experience in that regard, okay. Yeah, so I think Minister Chan also has a point. Whenever you have a project, it's a deal between China and whatever nation you're talking about. You got to trust they have some decent level of procedures, you know, I mean processes, rationality, and the intelligence of making a judgment. And China also forgive many loans. I don't know the precise number, you know. I mean, Venezuela, for example, how much money we invested? I mean, did Venezuela lose its solvency? I mean, we continue to extend more loans. There's some complaint even from China about extending too much loans to that particular country. But we are heavily criticized by the U.S. at the same time, sometimes ironic, Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Okay.
Yes.
But, Greg, I'll come to you. Certainly in the Western, there's resistance to Belt and Road, and there's growing resistance, led largely by the U.S. Is this going to thwart, delay the project, or, as I said, end it potentially, or is this a bump in the road?
I think it's a bump. I think it's a bump, and my reason for saying that is that you need to think about two things. One is the demand for infrastructure, which far outstrips the capacity of governments to be able to pay for it currently, and so it's going to need as many hands to the pump as possible to provide the infrastructure that's necessary to keep up with the rate of population growth and urbanization across the countries of the Belt and Road. And the MDBs agree that the demand is a couple of trillion per annum between now and pick a date, 2035, something like that. And they can only see where they could maybe muster about a half of that from governments, and that includes the Chinese government. So the demand is there, and the demand is going to need as much supply as it can get and probably won't be fully met. And therefore, keeping China out of the game, is just not realistic. So that's one thing. The second thing to think of is, so China has built this capacity over the last 40 years to plan and design and construct infrastructure. But the point is not, infrastructure isn't a thing unto itself. The point of infrastructure is it's there to stimulate and support economic and social development. And the 800 million people who've been lifted out of poverty in China in the last 40 years have been as a result of carefully planned, strategically planned infrastructure, which has underpinned then economic development. So it's an essential component of economic development. Now, the Chinese have built that capacity, and they've got it to the point where the basic civil infrastructure of the country is largely built out, 85% maybe. I mean, their high-speed rail network is nearly complete, and so on and so forth. Their power network is largely complete, and so forth. And it would just be completely economically wasteful to take that capacity and bin it. In other words, it needs to be deployed where demand is. So I think we should call the elephant in the room about the bump in the road. It's geopolitics. It's not quality concern. It's not debt trap. It's geopolitics. Has the execution been clumsy on the Chinese side in some places? Yes. Have recipient countries irresponsibly ask for projects that they can't afford to pay down the debt of? Yes. But does that mean the whole program is questionable? No.
Because we know you're China Bureau Chief and you've got a long history of reporting out of China. Do you pick up anything in Beijing that China has recognized that these bumps in the road might require them to adjust their position in how they approach Belt and Road projects with neighboring countries?
Well, not Belt and Road per se, but last year I attended a forum in Yunnan, and what came out of it was that a sense that the Chinese do recognize that there are problems with the projects in these in host countries. There's some unhappiness over the way these projects are managed. For example, the Chinese bring an entire production chain to these countries. So you have even down to the cooks and cleaners. And so the sense is that the local community does not have a share of this economic activity. The local communities do not benefit from it. So, and culturally also, it's how the Chinese deal with the local. So there is a recognition that the Chinese need to change the way that they manage these projects.
Yeah.
And
yeah, no, that's good. No, go and. Do you see policy shifts or leadership saying this is how we need to do things? Do you see examples on the horizon of where there might be some test cases in projects?
I think that may be some time in coming.
Yeah.
They are recognizing it, but changing that culture is not going to be easy. And this is the point that was brought up by a former prime minister of Kyrgyzstan, and he saw this problem of how China, in its 5,000 years of statehood, has been looking inwards, right? It doesn't look out. And this is the first time that China is going out in a big way internationally, and it has a lot to learn how it needs to understand local culture, how it needs to interact with people on the ground. And I think this shift will be sometime in coming.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not
Okay.
so easy.
Can I follow up on that point?
Yeah.
And I know the enterprise in China fairly well. I did training for state-owned enterprises. One day, my Western counterparts criticized China and industrial policy. I said, well, Japan has it, Korea has it, what's wrong with China? I mean, Germany has one. And as well, that's because you have state-owned enterprises play a key role in that. I said, oh my God, that could be a plus, that could be a minus, depends on the way you look at it. You look at the early time, China's reform, we want to be export-driven. Well, the government wanted the SOE, state-owned enterprise, to play a key role in the whole process. Some succeeded, most failed. Why? Individually, they become super rich. They bought huge houses in San Francisco, Vancouver. The company went bankrupt. So sometimes, the strategy looking awfully good, but execution level, different story. So using SOE to drive, whether it's 2020 manufacturing or Belt Road, there's a plus, easier to coordinate. And then there's a high risk in that regard as well. I think some of the concerns definitely overstated,
Some of the concerns overstated.
Yeah.
So, building on that there's a concept, there's a need, there's a capacity, there's an incredible amount of experience of eliminating poverty for hundreds of millions of people in a very short period of time. But even in China, there was breakage along the way, tremendous environmental consequences, sometimes bad debt problems, sometimes execution issues. So recognizing that, what's the right response? And I think there are some things going on which suggest there's a way through this. You said China's conscious. They may not be ready to change. No country changes its culture. But in going out, one of the most basic needs is to have standards and to recognize standards. And I think if you look at, Greg and I were, last December was the UK Economic Financial Dialogue is going on in Beijing. And there was a PBOC, Bank of England program. There's still work going on, green finance or whatever, to set standards of sustainability around the Belt and Road. So multilateral development banks can play a role in this. But one of the most basic things is the engagement. Standing on the sidelines and criticizing isn't going to make it better. So how do you get engaged, whether it's private, public sector, to set standards of environmental standards, economic sustainability, the local, how to deal with local and get local consent, the transparency necessary to avoid corruption. Those are things that getting those set and the training necessary to be able to execute better, there is hope, I think, if we can continue that kind of engagement and China takes that on board.
Gregory, you're actively involved, so Arup's actively involved in a lot of these projects, and standards is an issue that comes up fairly consistently, along with debt, but standards certainly. Do you see progress being made in internationalizing the standards of some of the projects?
Well, I think using the term standards actually is a little bit misleading because we have to define what we mean by standards. If we're talking about technical standards, the Chinese trains run on time, the fire safety standards are good, people get out of buildings in a fire, the infrastructure works, their technical standards are very good. So it's not a question of that. It's rather a question of investability. So sufficient transparency so that we can bring market forces to bear to make up that gap between the 1 trillion and the 2 trillion US dollars a year demand that there is for infrastructure is going to need private sector investment, and in large amounts.
Yes.
And beyond project by project by project, we really need to develop infrastructure as an asset class in order to make it investable. For it to be investable, investors need to be able to see that they can get their money in, they can get their money out. There's a level playing field, there's transparency, there's liquidity, all these things that financial markets need to be able to invest. So the people need the infrastructure needs the money will drive, you can call that standards if you want to, but I think it's misleading because we're divided by a common language there. When the West says standards to the Chinese think we're talking about their technical standards, their operational standards, and we're not. We're talking about investability, really. So I think we should change that language. And I think ultimately, if we do, and this is where I think Western institutions, Western companies have a contribution to be able to make, because it's true the Chinese have done their infrastructure development in a very short space of time, 1 generation, less than 1 generation. I mean, I worked on projects in China in the 1980s, which were the very first, wave of, and they invited foreign capital in to help those very early infrastructure projects happen, toll roads and power stations and the like, which were the first, and then a wave of hotels so that foreigners could come and they'd have a place to stay. It was all very planned. So that the Chinese experience has been very quick, very large. Of course, there have been failures along the way. By the way, in the West, we had tremendous failures. We just did it a little time ago. But we had all kinds of things that went wrong in the West as we developed our infrastructure in Britain and in North America, all over the West. So China's not unique in this. They've just done it quickly and at large scale. What we've got to offer, though, is 50 years, 80 years, 100 years, 200 years in some cases of company experience working in the third countries in which these Belt and Road projects are happening. So what I think we've got to be able to offer to the Belt and Road program is the knowledge of how things work in the third countries, the understanding that third countries don't operate the way that China does, which they did in many respects. I mean, the strategic planning that there is in China is one of the things that's allowed it to pull those 800 million people out of poverty as quickly as they have. But if we work together, we can make it a success. I'm quite convinced about that. And I think, it's a pendulum thing. There might be some bumps, but ultimately it's like trying to stop gravity. You won't be able to stop it. The demand is just too great.
Mobilizing private capital, though, is a big part of this. Is developing capital markets has to be part of the answer for financing some of these projects, doesn't it?
Yes. When you take the trillions that are projected, you can look at McKinsey's, PwC's, whatever projections, you're talking about so much financing that's needed. For the countries that need this the most to finance that, it wouldn't be responsible. We're going to be having another problem discussion here in another year or two if it's too much is financed by cross-currency, foreign currency debt. And so the long-term way to build sustainable finance in most of these countries, which have high savings rates. It's interesting, you look around ASEAN, you see there's very high savings rates, but the money typically isn't mobilized into long-term investment. And so the way to match the need for infrastructure and the need for sustainable financing of that is to build up the local capital markets. And the scale is staggering. If you look at just across the ASEAN region, Singapore, we all know. Infrastructure's built, financial, capital markets are there. If you look at insurance, pension, and mutual fund assets as a percent of GDP, it's over 100%. But you go to the other extreme and go to Indonesia, it's 9%. So the mobilization, how to finance it, Indonesia already is feeling, I think, some burden of too much foreign debt.
Yes.
So that's a big part of it. The other, just to mention, I think there will be maybe unintended good consequences of financing more infrastructure using bonds, equities, et cetera, and that's around the transparency. What Greg was saying is that by having to subject a project to the scrutiny of a rating agency or having to build a prospectus and take it out to investors, a great amount of transparency will come on to the financing of the project and who's behind it and the qualifications and the risk mitigation. And that will go a long way toward making any kind of infrastructure, whether it's Belt and Road or one that's not Belt and Road, a better project.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing about that specific point. I don't disagree with Minister Chan very often, and maybe he just didn't complete the thought, but there is an important point that relates directly to what Donald just said, and that is that not all infrastructure has an immediate market payback. There's infrastructure that can be paid for on the basis of user charges, one way or another, real or virtual. But much infrastructure, particularly in developing countries, or less developed countries, let's say, much infrastructure has a social as well as economic purpose. And finding a market mechanism to get your money back from that, requires kind of synthetic products or some quite sophisticated approach. Traditionally, this is where the public sector steps in and finances it as public good. So, when Minister Chan this morning said, the market is the way to cut through, to iron out the bumps, I mean, I completely agree with that, but we also need a mechanism to be able to recognize that other infrastructure, vitally important social and economic infrastructure, has a very long-term and very diffuse set of benefits. And it's not immediately obvious how those can be directly harnessed in a, get your money in, get your money out kind of way.
Yeah. Okay. So let me open up to questions now from the audience too. We'll come to you, Professor, but let's open it up. Just identify yourself, please, name and organization. Well, I'll start with Martin, then I'll come to my chairman.
Hello, Martin Barrow of the Jardine Matheson Group. Does the panel think that BRI can enhance the importance and relevance of the travel and tourism sector with all the infrastructure developments and across the world? That sector often gets underestimated of its export value and its contribution. How can that play a role?
Well, there are 130 million Chinese traveling abroad already. I'm very positive we'll do a great job in promoting tourism. I'm very positive. I don't have a number for that.
Well, and as well, when the Belt and Road Initiative was launched by President Xi Jinping 5 years ago, he said that it had 5 purposes. It wasn't an infrastructure project as such, but the 5th purpose, and maybe the most important, is to encourage people-to-people bonds. And, those people-to-people bonds arise from people traveling and meeting each other. And I think that's a very important, point. And it goes to the business of, should we be trying to, from the West, contain China, which we heard this morning, I don't think that's very sensible. China's determined to continue to open up, which has got to be good, hasn't it? I mean, it's got to be good. And got to be good for all of us. And a very important part of that is the people-to-people bonds. We understand it, we begin to understand each other, and tourism and traveling is a means to that end.
Actually, a saying by Deng Xiaoping, the liberation of thoughts, when people get the opportunity to see how Singapore and Hong Kong are functioning, that's far more important than foreign aid. That's very important. We have roads, bridges, people travel. People, they see things differently. The good things will come later.
Stephen, and then we'll come over there.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a slightly awkward question. Greg Hodkinson, in describing some of the bumps on the road, I think quite rightly referred to them being essentially technical, implementation, financing and investment. And he said, and you can correct me if I've conceived the point, that the only real obstacle, the only more fundamental obstacle was geopolitics, which rather could be held to imply that if only you just get the politicians out of the way, this will all be fine. But anyone who goes to India will know that there's very considerable nervousness in India about the Belt Road Initiative and a sense of potential encirclement. Now, India is either already or about to be the largest country in the world, not economically, of course, but by population. And any perspective on the latter part of this century would suggest that China is not only going to have to work closely with America, which it takes two to tango, I fully recognize that, but also to work closely with India. And I pose, therefore, the question of whether the way in which the Belt Road Initiative is being talked about and implemented is sensitive enough to the concerns that are very tangible in the atmosphere in India.
Ask each of you that. We'll start with you, Professor.
Well, definitely, I don't think China will view India as a key competitors now, at least. That's not true. But definitely, India is on the rise to become the country with large population. If you look at the capability of Chinese companies, which has been sort of among the best in leveraging low-cost labor, India will have all of that. I think the Chinese capability were flagging well in that regard. There's a lot of synergies. There's a good reason for collaboration between the two nations. To me, I don't think the Belt Road Initiative is really targeting India. I think there's some sort of arm twisting between China and U.S. in trying to reconfigure a global trading system, but not targeting India for sure. That's my 2 cents.
But there are clearly concerns in India. Does China have to grapple with that and deal with that?
I think China and India will continue to have to engage on a whole range of trade and opening issues. Our conversations in the last 10 years in the international conferences like this tend to be the West and China. But if you go to some of the big international conferences in China now, go to the Boao Forum, you'll see that some of the most interesting tangles are now occurring. The Westerners aren't involved on the panel. It's between India and China, the two biggest countries in the world. And historically, if we go back a few hundred years, the two dominant economies of the world for a great period of human civilization. So I think what Stephen's raising is a very important point. I think Belt and Road is a piece of a very, very big economic puzzle that needs to be sorted out. And I think the main actors in sorting that out will be India and China.
Maybe we should look at Japan and its attitude towards Belt and Road through the years. It did not want to participate in it at all, but it's come around to recognizing the importance of this project, and it has said that it will take part in Belt and Road on a case-by-case basis. And the whole idea is to, going back to standards, to raise the standards of the projects. And okay, there's also that competition with China, there's the rivalry. So Japan has also cooperated with Japan, with India, what they call the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, right? So powers in the region will always view Belt and Road with some wariness about China trying to expand its influence in the region. And there is some amount of truth in that. I mean, you look at Xi Jinping and his 19th Party Congress speech, he talked about China moving closer to the center stage of the world. He talks about China contributing to mankind through projects like Belt and Road. So I guess in the broader scheme of things, Belt and Road is good for the region. And there are a lot of benefits to be had economically for countries, organizations, and governments, and companies taking part in it. Yeah, provided, of course, we have what is called, what Mr. Chan this morning talked about as market discipline, right? So I don't think India should view Belt and Road as something that threatens it. There is rivalry between the two countries. They are the biggest powers in the region. But there are benefits to be had. And China, of course, needs to explain itself more, I think, about its intentions, right? And build more trust with its neighboring countries where this project is concerned. But yeah, I don't think powers should fear, in the region should fear.
But Gregory, that India question is one because there is huge resistance in India. Japan has softened its line.
Yes.
Absolutely. Do you see India doing the same?
Well, you know, I was sitting here thinking, well, what do I know? You know, I'm a consulting engineer, really. But then I thought, I'm the same age as Xi Jinping, and he's also an engineer. And, and we're both Geminis. So
you're an expert, please.
So, you know, why not? Okay. You know, there are very real geopolitics at play, of course, Stephen. And it's a question of how you interpret what's happening. So, you know, in the West, we've got, what, 10% of the population of the planet, and we've basically controlled it for the last couple of hundred years, or certainly had, you know, way more than our fair share of the pie, if you can think about the world that way. And that's changed. You know, the re-emergence of China onto the world scene, which, you know, in the Chinese view is a re-emergence, remembering that it was well on the world scene, you know, until the first quarter of the 15th century. The re-emergence of China on the world scene, at the rate at which it's re-emerged, is like another sun entering the solar system. And you can't do that without there being consequences. You know, gravity changes, and we're seeing that all play out. But in this day and age, with all that we have at risk and all that we have at our disposal, it would be folly, I think, for all of us to take a zero-sum view of this, and just short-termism to think that, you know, it can be encircled and resisted. At the very best, it might be slowed down a little bit, but wouldn't it be better to engage, always must be better to engage and to talk. You know, I mean, personally, I mean, what do I know? Do I think the Chinese are trying to encircle India with, you know, their Pakistan, route into the Belt and Road? No, I don't. I don't think that, but I could be wrong.
Final question, the lady over here, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel. Excellent discussion. I'm a research analyst. I was born in London, but the last 15 years I'm working in Central Asia and Singapore and a few other places. My specialism, my field of research is geopolitics, and I'm enjoying this last discussion very much. I'm also turning over the keywords that we've heard since this morning. Chan Chun Sing talking about excellence and quality. Shortly after that, I was hearing remarks about collaboration and communication and using AI to reach across borders. Our friend at Ripple talking about organizational culture, working together. I'm hearing Kai-Fu Lee talking about the success of the relentless entrepreneur, single-minded. What I'm drawing from this is a divergence of views, competition or collaboration. So as we look at the problem space that you've just sketched, and one considers all the failed models that we've seen the last 100 years, pivot, heartland, axis, convergence, divergence, world stage, re-emergence. What's coming next, the next 50 years? What new language can we come up with? Would the panel care to comment on, do they see this being a new global order that's around competition, collaboration, or perhaps adaptation? Thank you.
Okay, is the new global order competition, collaboration, or adaptation?
Well, to me, it may be the first time in human history we have so many transformative changes concentrating one point in time. I talk about development models, reconfiguration, global trading system, disruptive technology, the political system, social contract, deep trouble, the global governance, sustainability, whatever, and the collective myopia humanity. So if you're taking all this change together, despite a huge disparity between China, US, and many other major powers, I think the collaboration is the only way forward. And then the best time, the worst of times, if you don't collaborate, it'll be the worst of times. You can have any excuses. The only way moving forward is collaboration. Be positive, be constructive. Always construct. Let's fix the problem. If there is a problem, sit down, fix the problem.
So vote for collaboration here.
Do you eat or do you breathe? I mean, collaboration or competition, co-opetition. You know, it's going to be both, right? We would be naive to say it's one or the other. I think what's most important right now, engage, be positive, and deal with problems. I think that's very constructive advice. If someone very wise once said to me, you can't talk your way out of a problem you behaved yourself into. So just more talking and explaining isn't going to do it. It's going to take a matter of actually dealing with these issues, reducing risk in projects, making them more sustainable. And we discussions this morning around the rules of engagement and trade, creating at least the feeling again that competition is on enough of a level playing field that we can collaborate. I think part of the issue right now is some of the systems that, Greg alluded to the fact that the 10% has been benefiting, but the system that came out of World War II and in the next 20, 30 years is now experiencing some creaking and grinding, and it needs to be adjusted. And if it can be adjusted proactively and a sense of fairness exists enough, then I think collaboration is the way forward, and competition can be fair.
Yes, Vinoy.
Well, I agree about collaboration and the point that, you cannot get away from competition. The main thing is to put aside your differences. I think the Chinese have always said this, that, or going back to Deng, setting aside our differences and let's come and cooperate on issues that we can cooperate on. And basically.
Okay, Gregory, final word to you.
Well, I think business has a really important role in this. The nation states has a lot to answer for, and business can be a force for good because in my business we've got operations in 50 countries, and we don't compartmentalize our colleagues. We operate as one entity. We're very well connected technologically on one system. Over the whole, and this is where information technology is really, really helpful. But business, I think, is a force for reason and a force for good, and I think, I would hope that business rises to the occasion and is a force towards collaborating rather than the opposite.
Tremendous. I'm afraid we have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you all very much. Again, fantastic discussion. That ends the panel and ends our conference today. Thanks to all of our speakers. Thank you very much to our sponsors, Arup, Prudential, ABP, and also Straits Times, our media partner. Thank you to the Asia House team for doing such a great job putting this together. And thank you to you. Thank you for being here. Thanks for being involved. Thanks for being engaged. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. Please join us for lunch outside. Have a good day.